My name is Abigail. I am 32 years old. I work as a payroll clerk at a local logistics company in a small, quiet town in Ohio. For the past 4 years, my life has been a relentless, suffocating cycle of balancing spreadsheets, dodging aggressive debt collectors, and raising my 8-year-old son Toby completely alone. Everyone in my community looks at me with that same clawing gaze of pity. To them, I am the tragic young widow who lost her husband in a horrific, devastating factory fire. They see the exhausted single mother working double shifts just to keep the heat running during the bitter Midwest winters. I thought I knew the exact shape of my grief. I thought I had buried my heart along with the heavy bronze urn of ashes sitting on my living room mantelpiece. But I was about to discover that the greatest tragedy of my life was not a tragedy at all. It was a meticulously crafted, cold-blooded lie. It was a chaotic, overwhelming Friday afternoon at Chicago Union Station. The noise inside the massive terminal was absolutely deafening. Thousands of hurried travelers were rushing past us, their hard plastic suitcases clattering loudly against the polished stone floors. The automated public address system chimed continuously, announcing train departures and arrivals in a steady, metallic voice that echoed off the high-vaulted ceilings. The air smelled of roasted nuts, stale coffee, and the faint, acrid scent of diesel exhaust drifting in from the tracks. Toby and I were waiting for the regional train to visit my parents in Indiana. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend away, a rare and desperately needed break from my grueling work schedule and the endless pile of past due bills sitting on my kitchen counter. I was standing near the center of the concourse, adjusting the frayed strap of my worn canvas tote bag. I looked up at this massive digital departure board, squinting against the harsh fluorescent lights trying to find our track number. Toby was standing right beside me, clutching his small blue backpack tightly against his chest. He had always been a quiet, intensely observant child. He carried a heavy maturity far beyond his 8 years, a silent burden shaped by the early loss of his father. He never asked for expensive toys. He never complained when we had to eat macaroni and cheese for dinner 3 nights in a row. He just held my hand and told me he loved me. Suddenly, I heard a dull, heavy thud over the roar of the crowd. I looked down. Toby had dropped his backpack straight onto the dirty station floor. His small hands were suspended in the air, trembling violently. I immediately knelt down, my heart jumping into my throat, thinking he was feeling sick from the overwhelming crowds or the stuffy air of the station. I touched his small shoulder, but he did not even look at me. His face had turned the color of pale ash. All the blood had completely drained from his round cheeks. His eyes were wide with a mixture of absolute terror and impossible desperate hope. His gaze was fixed on a spot about 20 yards away near a busy luxury coffee kiosk. "Ma'am," he whispered, his voice cracked, barely audible over the rush of commuters. "That is Dad." I froze completely. My first immediate instinct was to pull him into a tight, fierce hug and comfort his grief-stricken imagination. It had been 4 years since the accident, but I knew children processed deep trauma in strange, unpredictable ways. Toby still sometimes woke up crying in the middle of the night, saying he dreamed that his father was coming home from his night shift at the factory. I followed his trembling finger, fully ready to gently explain that it was just a stranger, just a random man who happened to look a little bit like the father we loved and lost. But as my eyes landed on the figure standing by the marble counter, my blood turned to absolute ice. The air was violently sucked out of my lungs, leaving me gasping silently. The world around me, the rushing crowds, the loud announcements, the clattering suitcases, all faded into a muffled, distant hum. Standing there, waiting for a cup of coffee, was a man in a flawlessly tailored charcoal suit. He was casually checking his sleek smartphone, his posture relaxed and confident. He did not have the thick, scruffy beard he used to wear every winter. His hair was styled immaculately cut in a modern, expensive fashion. He exuded an aura of extreme wealth and privilege that was completely foreign to the hard-working, blue-collar man I had married. I saw the unmistakable glint of a heavy, expensive silver watch on his left wrist. I saw the polished shine of Italian leather shoes. But it was him, the slope of his broad shoulders, the distinctive sharp curve of his jawline, the exact way he shifted his weight onto his left leg while he stood still. It was unmistakably, undeniably him. It was Greg, the man I had mourned, the man I had wept for until I had no tears left. The man I had buried after the horrific factory fire 4 years ago was standing right in front of me. He looked more alive, more healthy, and more prosperous than he ever had in our entire 5-year marriage. I could not breathe. My mind became a chaotic, terrifying blur of impossible questions. Was I hallucinating? Was it a long-lost twin brother he had never mentioned? Or had the factory fire somehow spared him, leaving him with severe amnesia wandering the world until he built a new life? Logic and reason abandoned me entirely. Pure visceral, undeniable instinct took over my body. I dropped my heavy tote bag right there on the filthy terminal floor. I did not care about the crowds pushing past me. I did not care about our train to Indiana. I marched forward, pushing through a group of businessmen, my heart hammering against my ribs. With such brutal force, I thought my chest might physically shatter. Each step felt like walking through deep, freezing water. I reached the coffee kiosk just as the barista handed him a steaming paper cup. I raised my shaking hand and grabbed his arm. The fabric of his custom suit felt incredibly soft and expensive beneath my fingers, completely unlike the rough, grease-stained denim jackets he used to throw over our dining room chairs. I gripped his arm tight, my nails digging fiercely into his sleeve. I braced myself for the shocked confusion of a stranger. I braced myself for a bewildered, polite apology. Instead, the man turned it around slowly. He did not jump. He did not look panicked, startled, or surprised. He looked down at my pale hand gripping his expensive sleeve, and then he shifted his gaze upward to my face. His eyes, the exact same shade of light hazel I had stared into for years across our tiny kitchen table, were completely devoid of warmth, shock, or recognition. There was no amnesia. There was no confusion. He recognized me instantly. Then he looked down at Toby. My son had followed me through the crowd and was now hiding nervously behind my legs, clutching the fabric of my skirt, staring up at the towering man in trembling awe. Greg looked at our son, and then he flashed a cold, terrifyingly familiar smirk. It was the exact same arrogant smirk he used to give when he won a hand of poker with his friends on a Friday night. "Hey there, son," he said. His voice was incredibly smooth, deep, and chillingly calm. "You have grown." The sound of his voice, the reality of his living, breathing presence, hit me like a physical, crushing blow to the stomach. I stumbled back half a step, gasping for air, as if I had been submerged underwater. "Greg." I choked out his name, my throat tight and burning with a mixture of shock and rising bile. "How? How are you here? The police told me you were caught right in the center of the blast radius. They found your wedding ring in the ashes. We held a funeral for you. I have your ashes sitting on my mantelpiece right now." I was hyperventilating, the edges of my vision turning dark and fuzzy. I was ready to scream at the top of my lungs for the police. I was ready to demand an ambulance to collapse right there on the cold marble floor and let the madness consume me. But Greg moved with terrifying, practiced speed. He stepped forward, closing the distance between us. He grabbed my elbow with a vice-like punishing grip and forcefully but quietly pulled me out of the main walkway. He dragged me behind a massive, thick structural pillar near the restrooms, out of the direct line of sight of the main terminal traffic. Toby followed us, crying silently, too terrified to make a sound. Greg shoved me slightly against the cold stone wall. He did not offer a tearful apology. He did not break down and beg for my forgiveness. He leaned in close, bringing the overpowering scent of his expensive musky cologne right into my face. "Keep your voice down, Abigail," he hissed. His eyes darted around the station, scanning the crowd for security guards or police officers. "You want to know the truth? Fine, I will give you the truth. The ashes sitting in that cheap bronze urn on your mantelpiece belong to a nameless homeless drifter. Some miserable John Doe who died in an alley 3 counties over. I paid off a corrupt, greedy mortician in the absolute chaos immediately following the factory fire. I handed him $20,000 in cold, untraceable cash to swap the dental records and sign the official cremation forms before the state fire investigators could start asking too many questions. I felt my knees completely give out, but his brutal grip on my arm kept me pinned against the wall. "You faked your own death," I whispered, the horrific, sickening reality finally crashing into my shattered brain. "You abandoned your own son. You let us starve you, let us cry. You let me work myself to the bone to pay off your debts while you just ran away." "I had to do it," Greg replied coldly, his voice completely devoid of a single ounce of remorse or humanity. "I was drowning in massive gambling debts, Abby. You had no idea how bad it was. Vicious loan sharks were ready to break my legs and burn our house down. The only way out, The only way to clear the slate was to die and let the insurance company handle the rest. He looked at me with pure, unadulterated disdain. And you had better keep your damn mouth shut about seeing me here today. Do you hear me? If you blow the whistle on me, Abigail, you go down too. I made sure of it. He leaned even closer, his voice dropping to a menacing, lethal whisper. Remember the $1.5 million life insurance policy that was paid out? You are the one who signed the insurance claim forms. You are the one who legally accepted the declaration of death. If the federal authorities find out I'm alive and well, they will not see you as a poor, heartbroken victim. They will see a greedy wife who helped her husband commit massive million-dollar insurance fraud. You will go to federal prison, Abigail. And Toby. He looked down at my crying son with empty eyes. Toby will be thrown straight into the state foster care system. Is that what you want for our son? Do you want him growing up in a group home because you could not keep quiet? My blood ran completely cold. The threat was incredibly calculated, legally terrifying, and entirely lethal. He had thought of everything. He had trapped me in his own crime. Before I could even process the sheer magnitude of his betrayal, the loudspeaker above us chimed. The metallic voice announced the final boarding call for the first-class express train to New York. Greg released my arm, pushing me back against the pillar. He casually adjusted his tailored jacket, smoothing out the wrinkles my desperate hands had made. He checked his expensive watch one last time. "Have a nice life, Abby," he said, his tone as casual as if we had just bumped into each other at a grocery store. "Tell Toby his dad is watching over him from heaven. It is a good story. Stick to it." With a final, sickeningly arrogant smile, he turned his back on me. He walked away with confident, measured strides. He slipped seamlessly into the priority boarding line, flashed a premium first-class ticket to the waiting conductor, and stepped onto the luxurious train car. The heavy glass and steel doors slid shut behind him, sealing him inside his new wealthy reality. I stood completely frozen on the platform, paralyzed by a shock so profound it felt like physical trauma. My chest heaved as I struggled to pull oxygen into my burning lungs. Toby tugged frantically on the hem of my skirt, crying softly, asking me over and over again why Dad was leaving us again. I looked down at my weeping, confused child. I saw the old thrift store sneakers on his feet and the worn patches on his jeans. Then I looked back at the sleek departing train as it slowly began to pull out of the station, carrying away the monster who had stolen our lives. In that exact moment, something deep inside me permanently snapped. The mourning, exhausted, heartbroken widow who had dragged herself through the last 4 years of misery died right there on that station platform. The fear he had tried to instill in me dissolved, replaced by a heat so intense it threatened to consume me whole. I realized I was not just a victim of a cruel twist of fate. I was the target of a malicious, calculated financial conspiracy. He thought I was just a naive, desperate payroll clerk who would cower in fear at the mention of the authorities. He thought he could use my love for my son as a weapon to silence me. I reached down and wiped the tears from Toby's face. I grabbed his small, trembling hand and held it tight. I did not scream. I did not collapse. A terrifyingly focused, cold, and calculating mother took over my mind. Greg had built his shiny new life on a foundation of lies, stolen money, and the shattered pieces of our family. I swore to myself as I watched the train disappear into the dark tunnel that I would track the money. I would find the paper trail, and I would burn his perfect stolen life completely to the ground. My lungs completely forgot how to process oxygen. I stood there, staring at the man who was supposed to be reduced to a pile of grey dust inside a bronze urn in my living room. I wanted to scream. I wanted to open my mouth and let out a sound so loud it would shatter the massive glass windows of the train station. I wanted to grab the nearest security guard and demand they arrest this phantom standing in front of me. I opened my mouth, a ragged gasp tearing through my throat, fully prepared to yell for the police. But Greg moved with a terrifying practice speed that I had never seen before. He closed the distance between us in a single fluid step. His large hand shot out and clamped around my upper arm with a punishing iron grip. His fingers dug deeply into my flesh, right through my thin cardigan. Before I could even register the pain or formulate a word, he jerked me forward. He practically dragged me away from the busy coffee kiosk and out of the main pedestrian walkway. "Let go of me," I choked out, struggling against his hold. My voice sounded weak and entirely unrecognizable. He ignored my desperate protests. He shoved me roughly behind a massive stone pillar near the restrooms, completely shielding us from the view of the rushing commuters. Toby followed blindly behind us, his small face streaked with silent, terrified tears. My son clutched the fabric of my skirt, burying his face against my leg as he hid from the tall, imposing stranger who was wearing his dead father's face. I slammed my palms against Greg's chest, trying to push him away. The fabric of his expensive custom suit felt alien beneath my hands. "You are dead!" I stammered, my chest heaving as panic threatened to consume me entirely. "You died in that factory fire. I saw the police report. I planned your funeral. How are you standing here? How?" I waited for the breakdown. I waited for him to fall to his knees and sob out a miraculous story of survival and amnesia. I waited for a tearful apology for abandoning his family. Instead, Greg simply straightened his designer tie and looked down at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated boredom. There was no warmth in his hazel eyes. There was no guilt. He looked at me the way a person might look at a stray dog blocking their driveway. "Keep your voice down, Abigail," he commanded, his tone as cold and sharp as a scalpel. "You want answers? Fine. Stop making a scene and listen to me." I stared at him, paralyzed by the absolute lack of humanity in his voice. He leaned in close. The smell of his expensive cologne was overpowering, suffocating me with its rich, musky scent. It was nothing like the cheap soap and motor oil smell I remembered from our marriage. "The man you buried 4 years ago was a nobody," he whispered, his words slicing through the heavy station air. "He was some nameless, homeless drifter who wandered into the factory warehouse looking for a place to sleep on the night of the fire. When the explosion happened, he was caught right in the center of it. He burned beyond recognition. My stomach violently convulsed. I pressed my hand over my mouth, fighting back a sudden wave of nausea. "You let me bury a stranger," I gasped, my voice cracking under the weight of the horror. "It was the perfect opportunity," Greg stated matter-of-factly, as if he were explaining a simple business transaction. "I was drowning in massive gambling debt, Abby. I owed money to people who do not send polite collection notices. They were going to kill me. They were probably going to come after you and the boy too. I had to disappear. When I saw the drifter's body in the wreckage, I knew exactly what I had to do. I slipped my wedding ring off and tossed it right next to his charred remains. But the dental records," I sobbed, my mind scrambling to make sense of the nightmare. "The state fire investigators confirmed it was you." Greg let out a short, humorless chuckle. "A corrupt mortician is surprisingly easy to find when you have a desperate need and a lot of cash. I found a sleazy funeral director who handled the county overflow. I handed him $20,000 in untraceable bills while the fire investigators were still busy sifting through the rubble. He gladly swapped the dental records and signed off on the cremation forms before anyone could look too closely. The ashes sitting on your mantelpiece are just the burnt remains of a man nobody ever missed." I felt my knees buckle. If Greg had not still been gripping my arm, I would have collapsed straight onto the dirty marble floor. The sheer magnitude of his betrayal was incomprehensible. For 4 years, I had wept over a stranger's ashes. I had told our son beautiful stories about his brave, hardworking father who died a tragic, sudden death. I had worked myself to the absolute bone, scrubbing toilets and balancing payroll spreadsheets until my eyes bled, just to pay off the massive credit card debts this monster had supposedly left behind. I had mourned a ghost while the real man was out buying tailored suits and Italian leather shoes. "You faked your own death," I whispered, the reality finally settling into my bones like liquid lead. "You ran away and started a shiny new life while we starved. You let us mourn you. You let your own son grow up thinking he was fatherless. And I would do it again," he replied without a single ounce of hesitation or regret. He looked down at Toby, who was weeping silently against my leg. He did not offer a comforting hand. He did not even flinch. "It was business, Abigail. Strictly business. I needed a clean slate, and you provided the perfect alibi." I found a sudden surge of strength, fueled by pure visceral disgust. I wrenched my arm out of his grasp and took a large step back, distancing myself from his toxic presence. "I am going to the police," I declared, my voice shaking but rising steadily in volume. "I am going to march right out to that concourse and find a transit officer. I am going to tell them exactly who you are and what you did. You are going to prison, Greg. You are going to pay for every single tear we shed." Greg did not panic. He did not try to grab me again. He did not beg for mercy. Instead, a slow, sinister smile spread across his handsome face. It was a smile that made my blood run absolutely cold. It was the calculated grin of a predator who had already cornered his prey. "I would not do that if I were you, Abby," he said softly, his voice dropping to a dangerous baritone. He took a casual step toward me, backing me up against the cold stone pillar. "Think very carefully before you do something incredibly stupid." I glared at him, my heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my ribs. "You cannot stop me. You are a criminal." "Oh, I think I can," he murmured, leaning down until his lips were mere inches from my ear. "Let us take a little trip down memory lane. My sweet, gullible wife. Do you remember the life insurance policy?" The words hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. The $1.5 million payout. The money that was supposed to save us, but had instead been immediately locked away in an untouchable trust controlled by his sister Brenda. "You were the sole beneficiary of that policy, Abigail." He whispered, his words dripping with lethal poison. "You were the one who signed the insurance claim forms. You were the one who legally accepted the official declaration of death from the state. You are the one who processed the massive payout." I did not know I cried out defensively, taking another step back until my shoulders hit the hard pillar. "I thought you were dead. I had absolutely nothing to do with your sick, twisted scheme. Brenda handled the money. I never saw a single dime of it." "Do you honestly believe the federal authorities will care about your tearful ignorance?" Greg asked, mockingly tilting his head. "Do you think an elite insurance fraud investigator is going to look at a poor, struggling payroll clerk and believe she had absolutely no idea her husband faked his own death for $1.5 million? They will look at the hard paper trail, Abby. The facts are that my desperate broke wife filed a fraudulent death claim and collected a massive fortune." He stepped back, letting the crushing gravity of his threat sink into my mind. "If you blow the whistle on me, you go down too. You will be indicted for conspiracy to commit grand larceny, wire fraud, and insurance fraud. They will drag you out of your little logistics company in handcuffs while your coworkers watch. You will be facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary surrounded by hardened criminals." I stood there completely paralyzed. The breath was violently stolen from my lungs. He had trapped me. He had orchestrated the perfect crime and built an airtight legal cage around me to ensure my eternal silence. He had weaponized my own grief and my signature against me. And what about little Toby? Greg continued, his eyes drifting down to our trembling son with terrifying indifference. What happens to the boy when his mommy goes to federal prison for 2 decades? He has no other family. He will be thrown straight into the unforgiving state foster care system. He will bounce from one miserable, underfunded group home to another. He will be separated from everything he knows. Is that the life you want for him, Abby? Do you want to ruin his entire future just because you are feeling a little angry and vindictive today? You are a monster. I choked out the tears finally spilling over my eyelashes and burning hot paths down my pale cheeks. You are absolute evil. I am a survivor, he corrected coldly, casually adjusting his expensive silver watch, as if he had an important meeting to attend. And you are going to be a good, silent little widow. You are going to walk out of this train station and you are going to forget you ever saw me. If you ever try to contact me, if you ever breathe a single word of this to anyone, I will personally make sure the FBI receives an anonymous tip with highly compelling forged evidence about your active involvement in the fraud. I have the money and the resources to make it happen. I will burn your entire life to the ground and laugh while the ashes fall. Do we understand each other clearly, Abigail? I could not speak. I could not nod. I was trapped in a suffocating nightmare, drowning under the weight of his brilliant, malicious blackmail. My mind raced frantically, searching for a way out, searching for a loophole, but finding only solid brick walls. He held all the cards. He held my freedom and my son's future in his perfectly manicured hands. Before I could even attempt to form a coherent response, a loud metallic chime echoed through the massive terminal concourse. The automated public address system chimed to life, announcing the final boarding call for the first-class express train to New York. The metallic voice echoed off the high-vaulted ceilings, a stark reminder of the bustling world moving on around our private tragedy. Greg glanced at the digital departure board hanging high above the main corridor. He looked back at me, giving me one final dismissive once-over. His eyes held no remorse, only the supreme arrogant confidence of a man who knew he had utterly dominated his opponent. "Take good care of the kid, Abby," he said casually, as if we were ending a mundane conversation about the weather. "He really has grown. Maybe buy him some new shoes." With that final parting insult, he turned his broad back on me. He did not look back. He strode confidently toward the boarding gate, his expensive leather shoes clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor. He bypassed the long line of weary regular travelers, flashing a premium digital ticket on his sleek smartphone. A uniformed conductor smiled warmly and ushered him respectfully onto the luxurious first-class train car. The heavy glass and steel doors slid shut behind him, sealing him safely inside his wealthy, untouchable new reality. I stood perfectly still, frozen behind the cold stone pillar. The station around me continued its chaotic, rushing symphony of rolling suitcases and chattering crowds, but I heard none of it. All I could hear was the harsh, ragged sound of my own breathing and the quiet, heartbreaking sobs of my 8-year-old son. Mommy Toby whimpered, tugging desperately on the hem of my cardigan. Why did Daddy leave us again? Why is Daddy being so mean to us? Is he mad at me? I looked down at my boy. I saw the faded patches on the knees of his hand-me-down jeans. I saw the scuffed, worn-out toes of his cheap discount store sneakers. I saw the profound, agonizing confusion swimming in his innocent hazel eyes. He had lost his father twice. The first time to a tragic, fiery accident, and the second time to a cold, calculated abandonment. He was blaming himself for a monster's cruelty. I dropped to my knees right there on the filthy station floor, oblivious to the dirt and the grime. I pulled Toby fiercely into my arms. I held him so tightly my muscles ached, burying my face in his small, frail shoulder. I let him cry. I let my own tears fall soaking into his shirt. But as I knelt there, holding the only good, pure thing that had ever come from my miserable marriage, something profound and terrifying shifted deep inside my chest. The paralyzing shock that had gripped me began to melt away rapidly. The crushing despair of the heartbroken, exhausted widow dissolved into nothingness. In its place, a small hot ember of rage ignited in the very center of my soul. It fed on the vivid memory of Greg's arrogant smirk. It fed on the cruel, lethal threat he had whispered so confidently into my ear. It fed on the devastating sight of my precious son's tears. The ember rapidly grew into a roaring, suffocating inferno of absolute fury. It burned away my lingering fear. It burned away my chronic exhaustion. It burned away the naive, trusting woman who had slaved away for 4 agonizing years to pay off a dead man's fraudulent debts. Greg thought he had won the war. He thought his brilliant threat of federal prison would force me to cower in the dark shadows forever. He thought he could use my deep, fierce love for Toby as a convenient weapon to keep me entirely silent while he lived a life of extreme luxury built on our utter destruction. He deeply underestimated the woman he left behind. I slowly pulled away from Toby and gently wiped the salty tears from his flushed cheeks. I stood up tall, smoothing out the wrinkles in my cheap thrift store skirt. My hands were no longer shaking with terror. My vision was suddenly crystal clear, sharp, and entirely focused. The mourning, grieving widow died permanently on that train platform. A terrifyingly calculating and fiercely focused mother took her place. I was a professional payroll clerk. I knew exactly how to track complex numbers. I knew how to find the hidden paper trails that arrogant, careless men always leave behind. Greg Sterling had built a shiny new empire on a rotten foundation of stolen insurance money and swapped human ashes, and I was going to systematically dismantle his entire perfect world, piece by piece, until he had absolutely nothing left but the clothes on his back. "Let us go home, Toby," I said, my voice dead calm and steady, devoid of any remaining sorrow. "We have a lot of work to do." Have a lot. The drive away from the chaotic train station in Chicago felt like navigating through a thick, suffocating nightmare. My hands gripped the cracked leather steering wheel of my old sedan so tightly that my knuckles turned entirely white. In the rearview mirror, I could see Toby staring blankly out the back window. His small face was still incredibly pale, his hazel eyes heavy with a confusion no 8-year-old child should ever have to carry. He had stopped crying, but his absolute silence was somehow infinitely worse than his tears. I wanted to pull the car over to the shoulder of the highway and wrap his small trembling body in my arms. I wanted to stroke his hair and tell him that everything would be all right. But my throat was completely dry, and any words of comfort would taste like toxic lies. How could I possibly tell my son that everything was fine when the fundamental truth of our entire existence had just been violently shattered on a dirty marble platform? The rhythmic, heavy thumping of the tires against the asphalt became a steady metronome for my racing, frantic thoughts. The initial paralyzing terror Greg had tried to instill in me was rapidly burning away. It was being quickly replaced by a horrifying, crystal-clear sequence of memories. Every single struggle of the past 4 years, every tear shed in the dark, every meal skipped to save a few dollars was flashing before my eyes, taking on a sickening and sinister new context. I pressed my foot down much harder on the gas pedal, the engine of the old car whining loudly in protest, as we sped down the dark interstate back toward our quiet town in Ohio. My mind violently pulled me back to the bleak weeks immediately following the devastating factory fire. I remembered the heavy, oppressive smell of lilies at the funeral home. I remembered the endless line of sympathetic neighbors pressing cold casseroles and heartfelt condolence cards into my cold, trembling hands. But most vividly, I remembered the chilly afternoon I sat in the polished mahogany office of Greg's estate lawyer. I was a broken, grieving widow, wearing a borrowed black dress, clutching a damp tissue prepared to figure out how to feed my son without a father's income. I had known for years about Greg's life insurance policy. It was a $1.5 million comprehensive plan he had proudly purchased through his union. I had naively believed that massive sum of money would be the safety net that would keep Toby and me from falling into absolute poverty. I thought it would pay off the remainder of our mortgage cover, the exorbitant funeral expenses, and ensure my boy could go to a good college when he grew up. The estate lawyer, a stern man with cold, unfeeling eyes, had pushed a thick, heavy stack of legal documents across the conference table. His professional words had sounded like a foreign, complicated language to my grieving ears. He explained that Greg had secretly restructured all his financial assets shortly before we were married. He had quietly created an ironclad pre-marriage trust. I was not the beneficiary of the massive life insurance policy. The entire $1.5 million payout was routed directly into the trust, and the sole trustee appointed to manage every single penny of it was Greg's older sister, Brenda. I remembered sitting in that plush leather chair, feeling as though the solid floor had completely dropped out from beneath me. Brenda had been sitting right beside me that day, holding my hand and dabbing at her own dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. She had played the part of the devoted, heartbroken sister with absolute theatrical perfection. She squeezed my fingers tightly and promised me she would honor Greg's final wishes. She told me the trust was strictly locked away, solely designated for Toby's future college tuition and his adult expenses. She claimed her hands were legally tied by complex stipulations, and she could not disperse any of the funds to help me with daily living costs or the immediate crushing debts. I had no money to hire an aggressive lawyer to fight the trust. I had no emotional energy left to battle my own sister-in-law in a lengthy court case. I swallowed my rising panic and simply trusted her. I believed she was acting out of pure love for her dead brother's only child. The reality of my daily life after that meeting became a brutal, relentless test of physical and mental endurance. Greg had not just left me penniless. He had left me drowning in a massive dark ocean of hidden financial liabilities. Within a month of his supposed fiery death, the aggressive collection agencies began calling my phone at all hours. There were maxed out high-interest credit cards in his name, secret personal loans he had taken out from shady companies, and a massive second mortgage on our modest home that I knew absolutely nothing about. The total amount of debt was staggering. It threatened to consume everything I had ever worked for and leave us completely homeless. To keep a solid roof over Toby's head and prevent the ruthless bank from foreclosing on our house, I transformed myself into an unfeeling working machine. For 4 agonizing years, I worked grueling double shifts at the local logistics company. I balanced massive payroll spreadsheets until the tiny numbers blurred together into a meaningless gray sludge behind my eyes. When my regular day shift ended, I stayed late in the empty office to process accounts receivable for a meager overtime rate. I dragged my exhausted, aching body home long after the sun had set, only to wake up before dawn and do it all over again. I skipped lunch every single day, drinking cheap, bitter black coffee to trick my empty stomach into feeling full. I stopped buying new clothes entirely. I wore the same fraying slacks and faded blouses, rotating them carefully through the wash, hoping my judgmental coworkers would not notice the worn-out seams and the missing buttons. Any extra dollar I scraped together went straight to the aggressive debt collectors or to buying discount clearance groceries for Toby. I sacrificed my physical health, my fleeting youth, and my mental peace of mind to pay off the heavy obligations of a man I thought had died a tragic, honorable death. Through all of that grueling, endless misery, I never once asked Brenda for a single dime. She lived in a massive, newly renovated suburban mansion just a few towns over from our small house. She drove a brand new luxury SUV and took lavish, expensive vacations to Europe, claiming she was desperately trying to heal from the profound trauma of losing her beloved brother. When my hardworking parents voiced their deep suspicions about her lavish lifestyle, asking how she could afford such incredible luxury, while I was literally scrubbing floors to make ends meet, I fiercely defended her honor. I told my mother to stop being so cynical and unsupportive. I told my protective father that Brenda was a highly successful real estate consultant and her money was her own hard-earned wealth. I firmly believed she was guarding Toby's $1.5 million inheritance with the utmost integrity and moral grace. I invited her to our modest holiday dinners, serving her the best portions of food. I sent her cheerful handmade birthday cards signed by Toby. I taught my son to call her Aunt Brenda and to hug her tightly because she was all he had left of his father's side of the family. I nurtured and protected a close relationship with the very woman who was secretly orchestrating my utter psychological and financial destruction. The dark highway stretched out endlessly before me, lit only by the harsh, blinding glare of passing semi-truck headlights. The scattered pieces of the puzzle were finally snapping together in my mind with a brutal, undeniable logic. The realization hit me with the devastating, crushing force of a runaway freight train. It literally stole the breath right out of my burning lungs, making me gasp loudly in the quiet car. Greg did not just happen to fake his death to escape his terrible gambling debts. He did not pull off this massive complex insurance fraud entirely on his own. Brenda knew. She had to know everything from the very beginning. The pre-marriage trust was not a responsible traditional financial planning tool. It was a carefully designed, impenetrable vault built specifically to catch the massive insurance payout while leaving me entirely locked out in the cold. Greg had meticulously engineered his own fiery demise and purposefully designated his sister as the sole gatekeeper of the stolen wealth. They had orchestrated the entire sick nightmare together as a team. They had maliciously manipulated my deep grief, weaponized my blind trust, and left me holding the heavy bag for every single dime of debt while they walked away with a massive fortune. I gripped the steering wheel so hard, my short fingernails dug painfully into my palms, leaving deep crescent-shaped marks. The sheer calculated malice of their conspiracy was almost too immense for my brain to fully comprehend. While I was wearing cheap discount shoes with holes in the soles, standing in the freezing snow, waiting for a public bus because I could not afford gas for my car, Brenda was sitting on a mountain of cash, laughing at my incredible, gullible stupidity, while I was weeping bitterly over a heavy bronze urn filled with the burnt ashes of a nameless, unfortunate stranger. She was likely receiving secret phone calls from her very much alive brother, coordinating how to spend their stolen millions. They had treated me like a disposable, ignorant pawn in their grand scheme. I was the perfect naive widow who would dutifully sign the official death certificates, process the complex insurance claims, and absorb all the financial ruin without ever asking a single dangerous question. They thought my profound, fierce love for my son would keep me docile, compliant, and easily controlled. They assumed I would be too chronically exhausted, too beaten down by the relentless grind of poverty to ever look beneath the surface of their brilliant, flawless deception. A low guttural sound suddenly escaped my throat. It was not a weak sob of despair. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated, rising rage, the kind of raw, primal rage that burns away all lingering fear and leaves nothing but cold, hard, lethal clarity. I looked at the glowing digital dashboard clock. We were still 2 hours away from the Ohio border, 2 hours away from my parents' warm safe house, where I could safely leave Toby for the night. 2 hours away from the moment I would officially begin dismantling the elaborate wealthy illusion they had built on my suffering. I was a professional payroll clerk. I spent my entire waking life tracking money, auditing complex accounts, and finding hidden numerical discrepancies that arrogant, careless men thought they had successfully buried. Greg and Brenda firmly believed they had committed the perfect untraceable crime. They believed the money was safely washed and hidden away in the offshore accounts or untouchable corporate trusts. But large amounts of money always leave a distinct trail. Massive wire transfers leave permanent digital footprints. Fake shell companies have registration numbers and tax documents. Every single lie they told had a corresponding financial record waiting to be uncovered by someone who knew exactly where to look and how to read the math. The sudden fear Greg had tried to plant in my mind at the busy train station, the looming threat of federal prison, the horrifying threat of losing Toby to foster care evaporated completely into the dark night air. He had tried to use my powerful maternal instinct as a heavy iron chain to bind me into eternal silence, but he had made a fatal, arrogant miscalculation. He had awakened a protective maternal fury so deep and so completely powerful, it completely eclipsed any lingering fear of the corrupt law or of his vague, empty threats. I was not going to cower in the dark shadows anymore. I was not going to spend another single day wearing embarrassing thrift store rags, while the terrible people who destroyed my innocent family lived in extreme comfort and luxury. I was going to find the hidden paper trail. I was going to follow the stolen money straight to Brenda's lavish doorstep, and then directly to whatever wealthy, untouchable new life Greg had built for himself across the country. I was going to systematically burn their stolen, fraudulent empire completely to the ground. And I would not stop investigating until I had legally reclaimed every single thing that belonged to my son. The green reflective exit sign for our small Ohio town finally illuminated in the dark distance. I clicked the turn signal, the rhythmic mechanical ticking perfectly matching the steady, determined beating of my heart. The grieving, helpless widow who had boarded the train to Chicago that morning was gone forever. The exhausted, submissive woman who skipped meals and cried over past due collection notices had been permanently erased from existence. As I steered the old car off the highway and onto the familiar, quiet streets of my hometown, I felt an incredible, terrifying sense of sharp purpose. The war for our future had officially begun, and I was going to be the one to finish it. The drive from Chicago to Ohio was a blur of highway lines and suffocating terror. Greg had trapped me perfectly. My first instinct was going to the police. I wanted to march into a precinct and scream that my dead husband was walking around alive. But Greg's lethal warning played on a loop in my mind. You are the one who signed the insurance claim forms. If you blow the whistle, you go down too. I was the sole beneficiary before the trust swallowed it. I filed the death certificate. Federal investigators would not see a grieving widow. They would see a greedy accomplice who helped steal a fortune. I could not risk prison. I could not risk losing Toby to foster care. My knuckles throbbed as I gripped the steering wheel. The law itself trapped me, but I had one person left to confront, the one who had to know the truth, Brenda. Greg's older sister lived in a sprawling, renovated mansion on the affluent side of town. While I spent 4 years scrubbing floors in threadbare sweaters, Brenda used her brother's tragedy to build a kingdom. She claimed the insurance money was locked in a trust for Toby. She claimed her hands were legally tied, yet she drove a new luxury vehicle and wore custom jewelry. I pulled my rusted sedan into her sweeping driveway. Her immaculate lawn and perfectly trimmed hedges felt like a personal insult. The sheer audacity of her wealthy lifestyle made my blood boil. I parked my car, leaving it running for a moment as I stared at the massive oak front doors. My chest was heaving. The exhaustion of the long drive completely vanished, replaced by a burning, righteous indignation. I turned the engine off and stepped out into the crisp Sunday afternoon air. I marched up the stone walkway, my cheap discount shoes slapping against the expensive pavement. I did not bother to ring the doorbell. I grabbed the heavy brass handle and pushed the door open. The inside of Brenda's house smelled like expensive vanilla candles and fresh baked goods. She was hosting the Sunday church committee meeting in her open concept kitchen. A group of wealthy, well-dressed women from our local congregation were gathered around the vast marble island. They were arranging perfectly frosted cupcakes and slicing warm pies for the charity bake sale. The soft, polite chatter and the clinking of silver spoons against porcelain abruptly stopped the moment I burst into the room. Every head turned to look at me. I knew exactly how I looked. My hair was a messy, tangled bird's nest. My cheap clothes were wrinkled from the long car ride. My face was pale and my eyes were red-rimmed and wild. I stood in the doorway, breathing heavily, looking like a madwoman who had just crawled out of a nightmare. The contrast between my ragged poverty and their comfortable, elegant wealth had never been more stark. Brenda was standing at the head of the island, wearing a flawless pastel cashmere cardigan. She held a silver cake server frozen in midair. Her perfectly manicured eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Abigail, dear," Brenda said, her voice dripping with that fake, sugary sweetness she always used when she wanted to play the saintly sister-in-law. "We were not expecting you today. Is everything all right with little Toby?" I ignored the other women. I did not care about polite pleasantries. I marched toward the marble island, my eyes locked entirely on Brenda. My hands were shaking so violently, I balled them into tight fists at my sides. "Toby is fine," I said, my voice trembling with a raw, suppressed fury. "But you and I need to talk right now, Brenda. In private." The church ladies exchanged uncomfortable, nervous glances. One of them discreetly shifted a tray of brownies out of my way. Brenda set the silver cake server down on the counter with a soft clink. She maintained her composed mask, but I could see a brief flicker of annoyance flash in her eyes. "Abigail, we are in the middle of preparing for the parish fundraiser," she said, gesturing smoothly to the baked goods. "Surely whatever this is can wait until after the meeting. You look terribly exhausted. Why do you not go home and rest? I will come by later this evening." "No," I practically shouted, the sound echoing sharply against the high-vaulted ceilings. "It cannot wait. I am not leaving this house until you give me answers." Brenda sighed a deep, long-suffering sigh designed to show everyone just how patient she was being with her unstable relative. She gave the committee members an apologetic little smile and wiped her hands on a linen towel. "Excuse us for just a moment, ladies," she murmured. "Grief is a long, hard road." She stepped around the marble island and walked toward me. She placed a gentle, patronizing hand on my shoulder and tried to steer me toward her private study. The moment her hand touched my sleeve, I violently yanked my arm away. "Do not touch me," I hissed. "Do not pretend you care about me or my grief. I was in Chicago today, Brenda. I was at Union Station." The polite, fake smile on her face did not waver, but her entire body went completely rigid. I saw the tiny muscles in her jaw clench tight. "I saw a man today, Brenda." I continued, my voice rising steadily in volume, refusing to move. He was buying a cup of coffee. He was wearing an expensive gray suit. He did not have a beard, but he knew my name. He knew my son's name. "I saw Greg today." A collective, loud gasp erupted from the church ladies behind us. One woman actually dropped a porcelain saucer, shattering it on the hardwood floor. Brenda stood perfectly still. She did not look shocked or surprised. She looked at me with an expression of profound, calculating pity. She turned slowly to face the other women, putting both hands to her chest in a dramatic gesture of sorrow. "Oh, my poor sweet Abigail." Brenda whispered, her voice trembling with perfectly executed fake tears. "You are having an episode." The church ladies murmured in sympathetic agreement, viewing me not as a woman telling the truth, but as a tragic, broken widow losing her mind. "I am not crazy," I screamed, the frustration tearing through my throat. "Do not stand there and lie to me, Brenda. You knew he was alive this whole time. You two planned the factory fire. You planned the fake ashes. You stole the insurance money while I scrubbed toilets to pay his debts. You are a thief and a liar." Brenda let out a loud, heart-wrenching sob. She covered her face, playing the role of the devastated, deeply wounded sister to absolute perfection. She took a step toward me, shaking her head mournfully. "Abigail, please stop this madness," Brenda cried out, her voice echoing with theatrical anguish. "Greg is dead. He died in that terrible fire 4 years ago. We buried him together. We wept together. Why are you doing this to me? Why are you tearing open these old painful wounds in front of our friends?" One of the older church committee members stepped forward, placing a protective arm around Brenda's shoulders, while glaring at me with deep disapproval. "Abigail, you need to go home. the older woman said sternly. You are clearly suffering from a severe delusion. The anniversary of his passing is approaching, and it is playing tricks on your mind. You are traumatizing Brenda. She has done nothing but support you and Toby. My chest heaved as I looked around the room. I was surrounded by hostile, disbelieving faces. Brenda had spun a masterful web of lies, establishing herself as a pillar of the church community and a generous local philanthropist. She had built a fortress of social respectability, and I was just the exhausted payroll clerk raving about ghosts. I had walked straight into a trap. I had brought the truth to a room full of people who had already been bought and paid for by her charity. I realized with a sickening, sinking feeling that logic and truth held absolutely no power here. Brenda pulled away from the older woman and stepped very close to me. She reached out and wrapped her arms around me in a tight, suffocating embrace. To the women watching, it looked like a beautiful gesture of pure Christian forgiveness. It looked like a loving sister trying to comfort a broken soul. But as she pressed her cheek against mine, she leaned in, bringing her mouth right to my ear. Her voice dropped to a venomous whisper that only I could hear. The sweet tone vanished, replaced by cold, ruthless malice. You really are a stupid payroll clerk, Abigail. She hissed, her breath hot against my skin. You think you can barge into my home and make these wild accusations? No one here will believe a word you say. Look at you. You look like a homeless vagrant. You have no proof. You have absolutely nothing. I tried to pull away, but her grip on my back was strong, pinning me in place. She continued her quiet, lethal threat. If you ever speak my brother's name to another living soul, I will destroy you. I am respected in this town. I have the money to ruin your life. She squeezed me even tighter, her fingernails digging painfully through my cheap blouse. I will pick up my phone and call Child Protective Services, she whispered the words, slicing directly into my heart. I will tell them you have suffered a complete psychotic break. I will tell them you are a delusional, unfit mother who's hallucinating dead people. With my wealth and my standing, the state will take Toby away from you before the sun goes down today. They will place him in a group home and you will never see him again. Do you understand me, you pathetic loser? Keep your mouth shut or I will take your son. She released me abruptly, taking a step backward and bringing her hands to her face to wipe away a fresh batch of fake tears. I stumbled back, gasping for air, as if she had physically choked me. The sheer fever of her threat paralyzed me completely. She was weaponizing my child against me. She knew Toby was the only thing I cared about, and she was holding a blade right to his future. I looked into Brenda's eyes and saw a monster smiling back at me from behind a mask of perfect suburban grief. I need you to leave my house, Abigail Brenda said loudly, her voice trembling with false sorrow for the audience. Please go home and get some psychiatric help. I cannot let you disrupt my home with these cruel, insane delusions anymore. The older church woman walked over and opened the heavy front door, pointing sternly toward my rusted car. It is time for you to go, the woman demanded. I looked at Brenda one last time. The furious burning rage inside me did not diminish, but it compressed into something hard and dense. Screaming would only prove her point. Fighting would only give her the excuse she needed to call the authorities and take my son. I was isolated, completely alone, and fighting a terrifying two-front war against people who held all the wealth and all the power. I did not say another word. I turned my back on the luxurious kitchen and walked out the door, stepping back into the cold afternoon air. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind me with a loud, final thud. I walked slowly to my car, my mind racing with cold, calculating clarity. They thought I was beaten, but they had just made the absolute biggest mistake of their entire lives. I drove away from Brenda's sprawling suburban estate, with my hands gripping the cracked leather steering wheel of my old sedan so tightly that my knuckles turned entirely white. The echo of her venomous threat still rang in my ears, bouncing around the confines of my car like a physical blow. She was going to call Child Protective Services. She was going to use her vast wealth, her flawless reputation, and her impeccable social standing in our church community to paint me as an unfit, delusional mother suffering from a profound psychotic break. The sheer suffocating terror of losing Toby to the state foster care system had initially paralyzed me on her front porch. It had left me breathless and defeated, but as the miles stretched on, carrying me further away from her massive, newly renovated mansion and closer to the modest, struggling reality of my own life, that paralyzing fear began to crystallize into something entirely different. The terror slowly hardened into a cold, unbreakable, and terrifyingly clear resolve. Screaming my lungs out in a luxurious kitchen filled with wealthy, judgmental church ladies had achieved absolutely nothing. It had only given Brenda the perfect opportunity to gaslight me in front of an eager audience, allowing her to play the tragic, long-suffering sister while casting me as the unhinged widow. I realized with brutal, undeniable clarity that raw emotion was a luxury I could simply no longer afford. Tears, righteous indignation, and loud accusations would not save my son, nor would they reclaim the future that had been maliciously stolen from us. If I wanted to survive this dangerous two-front war against the man who faked his own fiery death and the sister who helped him steal a massive fortune, I needed weapons made of absolute steel, not sorrow. I needed hard, undeniable paper trails. I was a professional payroll clerk. For years, I had spent my days buried beneath complex financial spreadsheets, auditing numerical discrepancies and tracking missing company funds down to the very last fraction of a cent. I understood the quiet, indisputable language of money better than anyone else in their arrogant circle. People can lie with remarkable, terrifying ease. They can fake their own deaths, shed incredibly convincing crocodile tears at funerals, and stand in front of a devout church congregation, claiming absolute innocence and moral purity. But numbers do not lie. Numbers do not possess the capacity for deception or theatrical performance. When $1.5 million moves from a life insurance trust into the dark shadows of the banking system, it always leaves a distinct traceable footprint. The mourning, exhausted widow who had wept over a bronze urn was dead and gone. The meticulous, relentless accountant had officially taken charge, and she was going to balance the ledger. I spent the next 6 days operating in a state of absolute disciplined silence. I went to my grueling job at the local logistics company, smiled politely at my indifferent co-workers, and processed the weekly employee payroll with my usual quiet, unassuming efficiency. At home, I made absolutely sure that Toby felt safe and loved reading him extra bedtime stories and cooking his favorite meals with the cheap discount groceries I could afford. I did not shed a single tear. I did not mention his father's name. But beneath that calm maternal exterior, my mind was operating like a supercomputer, mapping out a meticulously detailed plan of attack. I needed access to Brenda's financial records, and I knew her personal routine far better than she realized. Every single Sunday morning, without fail, she stood proudly in the front row of the parish choir. She absolutely loved the attention, the spotlight, and the prime opportunity to showcase her flawless devotion to the entire town. Choir practice began promptly at 9 in the morning, followed directly by the main Sunday service, and then concluded with the weekly charity committee luncheon. That rigid, unwavering schedule gave me a solid, uninterrupted window of at least 4 hours, where her massive estate would be completely empty. I also knew a highly valuable secret about how she secured that lavish house. Years ago, during a casual summer family barbecue, Greg had laughed mockingly about his sister's terrible chronic habit of locking herself out of her own home. He had personally bought her one of those hollow fake resin rocks from a local hardware store and buried it deeply in the decorative mulch near her front porch, hiding a shiny brass spare key inside. It was an incredibly arrogant, foolish security flaw for someone hiding millions of dollars, but arrogant people rarely change their convenient habits. When Sunday morning finally arrived, the sky above Ohio was a crisp, cloudless blue, offering a stark contrast to the dark mission I was about to undertake. I dropped Toby off at my mother's small house, casually claiming I needed a quiet, uninterrupted morning to catch up on some lingering household chores and laundry. Instead, I drove my rusted, squeaking sedan straight back to the highly affluent side of town. I did not pull into her sweeping circular driveway. Instead, I parked 2 full blocks away from Brenda's estate, making absolutely sure my old car was completely hidden behind a dense row of tall cedar hedges belonging to a neighboring public park. I walked the rest of the way on foot, my pulse drumming a steady, heavy, and terrifying rhythm against my throat. The wealthy neighborhood was completely silent, the prosperous residents either attending church services or sleeping in late. I approached her massive property line, stepping softly onto the perfectly manicured grass to avoid making any crunching sounds on the expensive white gravel pathway. I reached the wide sweeping front porch and immediately dropped to my knees in the pristine freshly watered flower beds. My bare hands sifted frantically through the dark, damp wood mulch. For a terrifying, breathless moment, my fingers grasped nothing but wet dirt and thorny roots. Panic flared hot and bright in the center of my chest. What if she had moved it? What if she had finally updated her security system with smart locks and cameras? Then, my desperate fingertips brushed against something hard, dense, and unnaturally smooth. I pulled it out from the dirt. It was the fake resin rock, looking exactly as Greg had described it years ago. I turned it over in my shaking hands, slid the small plastic panel aside, and the heavy brass spare key dropped perfectly into my waiting palm. I stood up, took a deep, steadying breath to calm my racing heart, and slid the key into the heavy oak front door. The expensive deadbolt turned with a soft, satisfying, and metallic click. I pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside the grand foyer, immediately closing and locking the door firmly behind me. The house was immaculate, sprawling, and eerily quiet, filled with the faint, expensive scent of vanilla candles and high-end lemon furniture polish. I did not waste a single precious second looking at her lavish new leather furniture, the sparkling crystal chandeliers, or the expensive modern artwork hanging on the freshly painted walls. I had not come here to envy her stolen fraudulent wealth. I had come to systematically dismantle it. I moved swiftly and silently down the wide hardwood hallway, my cheap discount shoes muffled by the thick plush decorative carpets. I headed straight for the spacious, sunlit room at the back of the house that Brenda used as her private home office. The office was exactly what you would expect from a woman pretending to be a highly successful independent real estate consultant. A massive polished mahogany desk dominated the center of the room, flanked by towering custom-built bookshelves and a sleek ergonomic leather executive chair. Sitting squarely on the center of the desk was a top-of-the-line desktop computer, its monitor sleeping quietly. I walked over and gently jiggled the wireless mouse. The large curved screen flared to life, instantly illuminating the dim curtained room with a harsh, bright white light. To my absolute astonishment and profound relief, there was no complex password prompt blocking my entry. Brenda, in her supreme untouchable arrogance and her complete unwavering belief in her own brilliant deception, had left her primary administrative account wide open and fully logged in. She had clearly never imagined that the timid, chronically exhausted, and financially broken sister-in-law she had spent years terrorizing would ever have the sheer desperate audacity to step foot inside her personal fortress. I pulled out the heavy leather chair and sat down, treating the computer just like my familiar accounting workstation at the logistics company. I completely ignored her internet browser, her social media accounts, and her extensive personal photo galleries. I was on a highly specific hunting expedition, and my only prey was hidden financial data. I opened her primary document directories and began a systematic, rapid, and silent audit. I combed through dozens of digital folders labeled with mundane, boring titles like household utility expenses, church charity donations, and annual property tax receipts. It took nearly 45 minutes of intense laser-focused searching before I finally noticed a hidden password-protected subfolder nestled deep within an archived directory for a defunct landscaping business she had supposedly closed years ago. The hidden folder was simply titled College Fund. It was a cruel, sickening, and twisted joke, referencing the exact verbal lie she had used to lock me out of the life insurance trust and steal my young son's entire financial future. Fortunately, my years of miserable marriage to Greg gave me the exact psychological key needed to unlock it. Greg and Brenda were creatures of immense, unyielding vanity, and they shared a bizarre, nostalgic obsession with their childhood home address on Elm Street, a place they constantly referenced as the root of their greatness. I typed the specific street numbers and the capitalized street name into the flashing security prompt. The folder unlocked instantly, revealing its dark secrets. I leaned closer to the bright monitor, my eyes rapidly scanning the dense lists of file names, and the sheer breathtaking scale of their criminal conspiracy was finally laid bare before me. This was not a casual collection of personal emails or simple, straightforward bank statements. I had stumbled directly into the digital nerve center of a massive, highly sophisticated money laundering and embezzlement operation. My eyes widened as I opened a master Excel spreadsheet that tracked the complete, untethered movement of the $1.5 million life insurance payout. Brenda had not simply deposited the stolen money into a high-yield savings account and left it alone. She had deliberately created a complex, tangled web of offshore wire transfers designed to completely confuse and derail any standard financial audit. I traced the numerical columns line by line, my professional training kicking into overdrive. She had been funneling the money out of the primary trust in precise $10,000 increments. It was a classic textbook structuring technique known as smurfing, designed specifically to avoid triggering federal banking alerts and Internal Revenue Service reporting thresholds. These continuous calculated transactions were being routed entirely through a completely fabricated registered shell company, a limited liability corporation registered under a vague, generic corporate name designed to look like a standard consulting firm. I swiftly opened the corresponding digital bank transfer receipts located in the adjacent folder. The final destination for every single one of those structured $10,000 wire transfers was an offshore corporate holding account that ultimately fed directly into a private wealth management fund located in the state of Connecticut. And there, staring back at me in bold, undeniable, and damning black text on the official bank statements was the name of the primary account holder, Gregory Sterling. He had not even bothered to change his first name or adopt a complex alias. He had simply taken a new, wealthy-sounding surname, confident that his fake death certificate in Ohio would provide absolute permanent protection against any future inquiries. My heart hammered against my ribs like a frantic trapped bird, but my hands remained perfectly coldly steady. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket, wiped the camera lens clean, and began to photograph the glowing computer screen. I captured every single piece of evidence with relentless precision. I photographed the banking routing numbers, the specific account details, and the chronological transfer dates. I made absolutely sure the high-resolution camera focused perfectly on the limited liability corporation registration documents capturing Brenda's fraudulent digital signatures and the fake corporate mailing addresses she had used to establish the shell company. Then scrolling to the very bottom of the directory, I found the absolute crown jewel of my silent, unauthorized audit. It was a scanned, high-quality digital copy of a finalized real estate property deed. The official deed belonged to a sprawling, multi-million-dollar residential estate located in a highly exclusive, heavily guarded, gated community in Connecticut. The massive property was legally and jointly listed under the name Gregory Sterling and another woman, an heiress whose wealthy-sounding name I did not recognize, but who was clearly funding his luxurious new reality. I took dozens of pictures from multiple angles, ensuring every single pixel of the property deed was perfectly legible and ready for a courtroom projector. I meticulously documented the local property tax records, the exorbitant homeowners association fee receipts, and even the basic municipal utility bills registered to that specific Connecticut address. I was actively building an airtight, irrefutable, and utterly devastating federal prosecution file. I had the complete, unbroken financial footprints. I had the fake shell company registration details. I had the exact, undeniable physical location where the man I had mourned and buried was currently living his brand new stolen bigamous life. When I was absolutely fundamentally certain that I had captured every single damning document on my phone, I carefully closed the master spreadsheet and permanently locked the hidden folder. I pulled my cardigan sleeve down over my hand and thoroughly wiped the computer keyboard and the wireless mouse, making sure I left absolutely no physical fingerprints or trace of my presence in her sanctuary. I pushed the heavy leather executive chair back to its exact original position, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the mahogany desk. I walked out of the quiet home office, slipped silently out the heavy oak front door, and locked the deadbolt firmly behind me. I walked back to the flower beds and returned the brass spare key to its hiding place inside the hollow resin rock, burying it deep in the damp mulch exactly as I had found it. As I walked swiftly back down the silent, wealthy street toward my hidden, rusted car, the crisp morning air felt entirely different in my burning lungs. I was no longer a terrified, isolated victim running desperately from a wealthy woman's threat. I was a fully armed, incredibly dangerous adversary. Brenda thought she had permanently cornered me with her cruel, manipulative threats about calling the state authorities to take my beloved son away. Greg thought he had buried me alive under a suffocating mountain of fraudulent credit card debt and manufactured grief. They both firmly believed they had successfully committed the perfect, untraceable financial crime against an ignorant, helpless, and easily controlled woman. But as I sat in the driver's seat of my car, locked the doors, and looked down at the glowing screen of my phone, scrolling slowly through the absolute mountain of devastating financial evidence I had just secured, a cold, triumphant, and ruthless smile touched my lips. I finally had the heavy ammunition I needed to destroy their perfect illusion. The unassuming payroll clerk had just successfully completed her silent audit, and collecting the final balance was going to cost them absolutely everything they had stolen. The harsh, unforgiving glow of Brenda's computer monitor was permanently burned into my mind by the time Monday morning arrived. I had spent the entire night pacing the worn, threadbare carpet of my small living room, turning the photographic evidence on my mobile phone over and over again until my eyes ached. The digital paper trail I had uncovered was absolutely undeniable, laying out a massive financial conspiracy in cold, hard numbers. But reading spreadsheet data was simply not enough. I needed to see the final destination with my own two eyes. I needed to look upon the stolen kingdom my ex-husband had built over my supposed manufactured grief. I picked up my phone and dialed the local logistics company where I spent my days balancing ledgers. I forced my voice to sound raspy, weak, and exhausted, telling my stern department manager I had caught a severe stomach bug and desperately needed to use one of my rare unpaid sick days. Every single lost hour of wages was a heavy, damaging blow to my razor-thin monthly budget, but this particular mission was infinitely more valuable than a routine day of payroll data entry. I packed Toby his favorite peanut butter and jelly sandwich, tucking a small note into his lunchbox, and drove him to my parents' modest house just as the pale morning sun began to rise over the Ohio suburbs. My mother opened her front door, took one look at my unnaturally pale face and the deep, dark circles under my eyes, and immediately tried to usher me inside for a hot cup of tea and a lecture on overworking myself. I politely but firmly refused, claiming I just needed to go back to my dark bedroom and sleep off the sudden illness. I knelt down and hugged my son tightly, inhaling the sweet, familiar scent of his cheap apple shampoo, and promised him I would be feeling much better by tomorrow afternoon. As I walked back to my rusted, sputtering sedan, the crushing guilt of lying directly to my supportive family weighed heavily on my chest, but I knew it was absolutely necessary for their own protection. I was actively stepping onto a highly dangerous, unpredictable battlefield, and I needed to keep the people I loved as far away from the potential crossfire as humanly possible. The drive from our quiet town in Ohio all the way to Connecticut was a grueling, bone-aching 8-hour marathon of cracked asphalt, aggressive semi-trucks, and foul-smelling exhaust fumes. My old car rattled and shook violently as I pushed it down the long stretches of the interstate, the worn tires humming a loud, monotonous, and depressing tune against the hot pavement. I gripped the cracked leather steering wheel and watched the American landscape shift dramatically through my bug-splattered windshield. The fading Rust Belt industrial towns of the Midwest, with their abandoned factories and boarded-up storefronts, slowly gave way to the towering, intimidating glass skyline of New York. Finally, the scenery transformed into the lush, opulent, and meticulously manicured greenery of coastal New England. With every single mile marker I passed, the profound, sickening financial disparity between my daily reality and Greg's new life became more devastatingly apparent. I was burning expensive gasoline I could barely afford to purchase, driving a decaying vehicle that was one major pothole away from the local scrapyard, while he was living comfortably on the stolen millions that were legally meant to feed and educate his abandoned child. I finally crossed the state line into Connecticut by early afternoon, my muscles stiff and my stomach entirely empty. Following the precise GPS coordinates I had meticulously copied from the property deed hidden on Brenda's computer, I navigated away from the busy, congested commercial highways and turned onto a winding, heavily wooded two-lane road. The modest standard suburban homes quickly vanished from sight, replaced entirely by towering stone privacy walls, dense, impenetrable hedges, and massive wrought iron gates guarding properties so unbelievably large they looked like historic European estates. I finally reached the specific damning address. The grand entrance to Greg's new stolen reality was marked by two massive ivy-covered stone pillars and a set of imposing black security gates. High-definition surveillance cameras were mounted discreetly on the masonry, tracking every vehicle that dared to pass by. I knew perfectly well that I could not park my battered, noisy Ohio sedan anywhere near that pristine guarded entrance without immediately drawing the aggressive suspicion of private neighborhood security patrols. I drove a quarter of a mile down the winding road and pulled slowly onto a narrow, unpaved dirt shoulder, completely hidden by a thick, dark grove of ancient oak trees. I turned off the rattling engine, grabbed a pair of old, heavy brass binoculars I had borrowed from my father's, dusty hunting gear, and walked quietly back through the dense tree line. I moved carefully through the underbrush until I found a clear, unobstructed vantage point looking directly down onto the sprawling estate. The property was absolutely breathtaking in its luxurious, overwhelming scale. Beyond the tall iron gates sat a massive modern architectural marvel constructed of dark polished wood, its expensive floor-to-ceiling glass, and imported grey stone. Perfectly manicured emerald lawn stretched out flawlessly like a championship golf course, wrapping around a shimmering crystal blue infinity pool that overlooked a private tennis court. 3 luxury vehicles were parked casually in the wide, sweeping circular driveway. It was a multi-million-dollar fortress of extreme, untouchable privilege. I crouched low behind a thick, leafy wall of blooming hydrangeas, raising the heavy brass binoculars to my tired eyes, and I waited in the oppressive silence. The hot afternoon sun beat down relentlessly on my shoulders, making my cheap synthetic thrift store blouse stick uncomfortably to my skin with sweat, but I did not dare to look away for a single second. Nearly an agonizing hour passed before the heavy custom mahogany front doors finally swung open. My breath caught sharply in my throat, choking me. Stepping out into the bright, revealing sunlight was the very man who had legally officially died 4 years ago. Greg walked down the wide stone steps with an arrogant, easy and terrifyingly relaxed grace. He was dressed flawlessly for a casual, wealthy afternoon at an exclusive country club, wearing crisp white golf trousers, a tailored designer polo shirt, and expensive Italian leather loafers without socks. He looked incredibly healthy, his skin deeply tanned from vacations I paid for with my suffering, and his hair perfectly styled. There was absolutely no trace of the desperate, debt-ridden, and angry man who used to scream at ruthless collection agencies over the telephone in our tiny, cramped Ohio kitchen. But he was not walking out the door alone. The crushing physical blow that truly shattered the final remaining fragments of my broken heart walked out onto the stone patio right behind him. She was a stunningly beautiful, radiant woman with long, flowing blonde hair and flawless, glowing skin. She wore a flowing, clearly expensive silk summer dress that draped elegantly over her tall figure. And protruding clearly beneath the delicate, expensive fabric of that beautiful dress was the unmistakable, heavy curve of a late-stage pregnancy. She was easily 7 or 8 months along, glowing with the anticipation of impending motherhood. Greg turned to face her, a bright, charming, and loving smile plastered across his handsome face. He reached out with genuine tenderness, gently placing his large hand on her swollen belly, and leaned down to kiss her cheek with a practiced, sickening display of total, unwavering devotion. I lowered the heavy binoculars, my hands shaking so violently, I nearly dropped the brass instrument directly into the dirt. The sheer physical pain of that sight was entirely suffocating, threatening to pull me under. It was not a lingering romantic jealousy that tore violently at my chest. It was a profound, explosive, and righteous maternal outrage. Greg had callously, deliberately discarded our brilliant, sweet, and loving 8-year-old son as if he were nothing more than worthless, disposable garbage. He had willingly left Toby to cry for his father in the middle of the dark night to wear hand-me-down shoes with holes in the soles and to grow up trapped in the heavy shadow of a manufactured fiery tragedy. And now this absolute unredeemable monster was casually starting a brand new family, showering a completely new child with stolen wealth, extreme comfort, and fake affection, while his firstborn son suffered in artificial poverty. I desperately needed more information. I needed to understand exactly how deeply and thoroughly Greg had embedded his parasitic roots into this wealthy new world. I packed the binoculars safely away in my canvas tote bag and began walking quickly back toward where I had parked my hidden car. As I rounded a sharp curve in the shaded road, I spotted a large commercial landscaping truck parked near a side service entrance to the sprawling estate. A crew of tired groundskeepers was taking a short water break in the cool shade of the large oak trees, wiping their brows with white towels. I smoothed out my wrinkled, sweat-stained clothes, took a deep breath to forcefully steady my racing heart, and approached a young worker who was leaning casually against the side of the truck, checking his smartphone. "Excuse me," I said, forcing a polite, slightly naive and friendly smile onto my face. "I am a local freelance florist, doing some market research for a potential high-end client in this neighborhood. I was just admiring the phenomenal landscaping and architecture on this property. Do you happen to know the name of the family who owns this particular estate?" The young man looked up, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. He eyed me suspiciously for a long moment, clearly hesitant to discuss his wealthy, powerful employers with a random stranger wandering on the side of the road. I knew exactly how this transactional world worked. Information was a valuable commodity, and I was prepared to purchase it. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my extremely thin, worn wallet, and extracted a crisp, folded $100 bill. It was grocery money, utility money I desperately needed to keep the lights on back home, but I handed it over without a single flinch or second thought. The worker looked at the green bill, smiled broadly, and quickly slipped it into the pocket of his dirty work pants. "That is the Sterling estate," he said, his voice dropping to a low conspiratorial tone. "Mr. Gregory Sterling and his wife. He married into some seriously crazy old money about 2 years ago. Her family practically owns half the commercial real estate in downtown Manhattan. Her father is a billionaire property tycoon. They threw a massive wedding out in the Hamptons that was so big it actually made the local news networks. The guy hit the absolute jackpot out of nowhere. Word around the landscaping crew is that he is currently stepping in to manage her massive trust fund properties, now that they have a baby on the way, and she wants to step back from the family business." I politely thanked the young man, turned around, and walked steadily back to my hidden car. I climbed into the torn driver's seat and locked the doors, the suffocating heat of the closed vehicle perfectly matching the boiling, toxic fury completely consuming my mind. The entire horrifying scope of his layered, complex betrayal finally unspooled before me in brilliant, terrifying clarity. Greg had not simply faked his death in a factory fire to escape his dangerous gambling debts. He had meticulously orchestrated his own fiery demise, maliciously used his sister Brenda to steal my $1.5 million life insurance payout, entirely abandon his own flesh and blood, and then used that stolen capital to completely reinvent himself as a wealthy elite. He had committed textbook bigamy, marrying a wealthy heiress under a fraudulent identity to secure a permanent, untouchable position among the financial upper class. I gripped the steering wheel, my mind racing rapidly through the dark, cold, and logical progression of his actions. Greg was a professional, highly skilled parasite. He did not build wealth through hard work, he extracted it completely from the women who trusted him. He had drained my small retirement accounts, destroyed my credit score, and faked his death when there was absolutely nothing left for him to take from our miserable life. Now, he was legally married to the trusting daughter of a billionaire real estate tycoon. He was actively, calculatingly positioning himself to manage her massive multi-million-dollar trust fund. The sickening, terrifying realization hit me with the brutal force of a physical strike. He was going to do it all over again. He was going to slowly, systematically, and legally bleed this new pregnant woman and her powerful family completely dry, just like he had done to Toby and me. The stakes of my silent war had just shifted dramatically. This was no longer just a simple quest for personal financial revenge or a desperate, lonely attempt to reclaim my stolen insurance money. I was looking at an active, highly dangerous predator who was actively setting up his next massive financial kill. The pregnant woman standing on those pristine stone steps was not my enemy. She was his next naive, unsuspecting victim. If I went to the local police right now with only my grainy photographs of a computer screen, Greg's new billionaire father-in-law would simply hire an army of elite corporate defense lawyers to crush me into dust before the case ever reached a federal courtroom. They would bury me under endless expensive litigation, and Greg would quietly slip away into the shadows with his pockets full to start the cycle again. I realized that I could not simply attack the Sterling Fortress from the outside. I needed a devastating weapon that could strike directly at the foundation of his fake death. I needed an airtight, undeniable confession that would absolutely shatter his perfect Gregory Sterling identity and legally force the federal authorities to act immediately. My mind snapped quickly back to the digital wire transfers I had photographed in Brenda's office. The corrupt mortician who had accepted the $50,000 bribe to swap the dental records and falsify the cremation documents. A sleazy, greedy man named Mr. Higgins back in Ohio. He was the weak, rotten, and frightened link in their entire criminal chain. I started the roaring engine of my battered car, pulling out from the dark shadows of the wealthy estate and merging aggressively back onto the busy highway. I was driving straight back to Ohio, and I was bringing an absolute storm with me. The drive back from Connecticut to Ohio was a long, dark stretch of highway that gave me plenty of time to formulate a concrete strategy. I had seen the sprawling billionaire estate. I had seen the massive security gates and the undeniable wealth protecting my ex-husband. If I simply marched up to that Connecticut mansion and started screaming about a faked death, I would be arrested for trespassing before I even reached the front door. If I took my grainy photographs of a computer screen straight to the local police, Greg would just hire a team of elite corporate defense attorneys. They would drag the case through civil court for a decade, burying me in expensive legal motions until I went completely bankrupt. Greg had married into an empire. I could not launch a direct frontal assault against an empire. I needed an airtight, undeniable legal weapon that would bypass the lawyers and strike directly at the very foundation of his stolen identity. I kept my eyes on the white lines of the interstate, while my mind sifted through the digital audit I had performed in Brenda's home office. My brain naturally categorizes data looking for anomalies and outliers. There was one specific transaction buried deep within that master spreadsheet that kept flashing in my memory. Amidst all the offshore wire transfers and shell company deposits, there was a single domestic payment made locally in Ohio. It was a massive lump sum of $50,000 transferred from Brenda's fraudulent limited liability company to a local business account. The recipient was a man named Arthur Higgins, operating under Higgins Mortuary and Cremation Services. The payment was casually labeled as a professional consulting fee. The dark irony of the transaction made my blood boil. Why would a supposed real estate consultant pay a small-town mortician a $50,000 consulting fee exactly 3 weeks after a massive factory fire? It was the absolute weakest link in their entire criminal chain. Greg and Brenda were arrogant, but they had been forced to rely on a sleazy, desperate third party to legitimize the fake ashes. They needed an official signature on a county death certificate. Mr. Higgins was the man who had sold his professional license to cover up a bigamous insurance fraud. He was not a billionaire. He did not have a team of corporate lawyers to protect him. He was just a corrupt, greedy local businessman, and I knew exactly how to break a man like that. I arrived back in my Ohio hometown just as the sun was beginning to set, casting long, dark shadows across the quiet streets. I did not go home to rest. I did not change out of my wrinkled driving clothes. I drove my rusted sedan straight to the industrial side of town where the funeral home was located. Higgins Mortuary and Cremation Services was situated at the end of a declining commercial strip. The building was an old decaying Victorian house that had been converted into a business. The white paint on the wooden siding was peeling badly. The landscaping was overgrown with weeds. It was a stark, miserable contrast to the pristine multi-million-dollar estate Greg was currently enjoying. It reeked of financial desperation, perfectly explaining why a licensed mortician would risk his entire career for a stack of untraceable cash. I parked my car across the street, hiding in the shadows of a closed hardware store. I sat there in the quiet vehicle, watching the front door of the mortuary with laser focus. I waited for over an hour until I saw a young receptionist lock the front desk and walk to her car in the side lot. When her taillights disappeared down the street, I knew Arthur Higgins was entirely alone inside the building, closing up the books for the day. I reached into the passenger seat and picked up a thick manila folder. Inside the folder were crisp, high-quality printouts of every single bank statement, routing number, and wire transfer I had photographed from Brenda's computer. This was my arsenal. I stepped out of my car feeling a cold, calculating calm wash over my entire body. I crossed the empty street and walked up the creaking wooden steps of the funeral home. The heavy wooden front door was unlocked. I pushed it open, stepping into a dimly lit lobby that smelled overwhelmingly of cheap floral air freshener and old carpet cleaner. The silence in the building was heavy and oppressive. I walked deliberately down the main hallway toward the back office, where a single warm light was glowing. I stepped into the doorway. Arthur Higgins was sitting behind a cluttered desk, counting a small stack of cash and entering receipts into a dusty ledger. He was a balding, heavy-set man with a perpetually sweaty forehead and a cheap, rumpled suit. He looked up, startled by my sudden appearance. He immediately shoved the cash into a drawer and plastered a fake, sympathetic smile on his face, falling right into his standard customer service routine. "Good evening, ma'am," he said, his voice dripping with an oily practiced sincerity. "I am so sorry, but our viewing hours have concluded for the day. If you are here to discuss arrangements for a loved one, please have a seat, and I can certainly help you." I did not sit down. I stepped fully into his office, reached behind me, and firmly pushed the heavy door shut. I turned the brass deadbolt, locking us inside the room. The loud metallic click made Higgins jump in his leather chair. The fake sympathetic smile instantly vanished from his greasy face, replaced by a look of rising panic. "Excuse me," he stammered, standing up defensively. "What are you doing? You cannot lock that door. I'm going to have to ask you to leave immediately, or I will call the police." I walked slowly toward his desk, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. "You do not want to call the police, Mr. Higgins," I said, my voice dead calm and devoid of any emotion. "In fact, the police are the absolute least of your worries right now. I advise you to sit back down and listen to me very carefully." "Who are you?" he demanded, his eyes darting toward the phone on his desk. "My name is Abigail," I replied, stopping right in front of him. "Does that name ring a bell, Arthur? Let me refresh your memory. 4 years ago, I sat in your parlor weeping uncontrollably. I paid you $5,000 from my own depleted savings to cremate the remains of my husband, who supposedly died in a local factory fire. I took home a heavy bronze urn filled with ashes that you personally swore belonged to the father of my child." All the color completely drained from his face. He collapsed back into his leather chair, looking as though all the air had been violently punched out of his lungs. His sweaty hands gripped the armrests, trembling uncontrollably. "I do not know what you are talking about." He choked out, a terrible lie forming on his lips. "I process hundreds of cremations a year. I did my job according to the county health and safety regulations. You need to leave my office right now." I slammed the thick manila folder onto the center of his messy desk. The loud smack made him flinch. I leaned over the desk, placing both of my hands flat on the wood, invading his personal space. "I am a professional payroll clerk, Mr. Higgins," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "I spend 40 hours a week auditing financial spreadsheets, tracking missing funds, and finding numerical discrepancies. I know exactly how to follow a paper trail. I know how to find the dirty money that arrogant, careless men think they have successfully hidden." I flipped the folder open. I spread the printed photographs of Brenda's offshore wire transfers across his desk, making sure the $50,000 payment to his mortuary was placed dead center. I tapped my index finger hard against his printed name. "You received a $50,000 wire transfer from a fraudulent shell company exactly 21 days after my husband faked his own death," I stated, outlining the exact parameters of his crime. "You accepted a massive bribe to swap the dental records of a homeless drifter with my husband's files. You knowingly falsified state death certificates and signed off on a cremation to destroy the physical evidence. You helped my husband commit a $1.5 million insurance fraud, and you let me mourn a total stranger. Higgins was hyperventilating now, wiping the sweat from his brow with a dirty handkerchief. Listen to me, Abigail, he pleaded, his voice cracking with terror. You have this all wrong. It was a consulting fee for a real estate transaction. I swear to you, I did nothing illegal. If you go to the local police with this, they will laugh at you. This is circumstantial evidence at best. I smiled a cold, humorless expression that made him shrink further into his chair. I am not going to the local police, Arthur. The police require search warrants and probable cause and months of tedious detective work. No, I am going straight to the Internal Revenue Service. The letters IRS hung in the stale air like a physical threat. Higgins swallowed hard, his eyes glued to the bank statements. I have already prepared a comprehensive federal whistleblower report. I continued pacing slowly behind his desk. I will hand over these documents to a federal tax auditor. I will show them how you accepted $50,000 in unreported, untaxed income from a known money laundering operation. The IRS does not need a warrant to destroy your life, Arthur. They will immediately freeze your business accounts. They will seize this funeral home. They will seize your personal residence and empty your retirement funds. They will conduct a forensic audit of every single cremation you have performed for the last 10 years. When they find out you committed federal wire fraud and conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, you will not just lose your license. You will spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary sharing a cell with violent felons. I stopped pacing and leaned in close to his ear. I am going to completely obliterate your entire existence, Arthur, unless you give me exactly what I want right now. The psychological pressure of a massive federal tax investigation completely broke him. He was an ordinary sleazy businessman looking for a quick payout, not a hardened criminal mastermind. He buried his face in his hands, letting out a pathetic whimpering sob. Please, he begged, his voice muffled by his sweaty palms. Please do not call the feds. I had no choice. Greg and his sister Brenda came to me. They offered me cash. My business was failing. I was going to lose the funeral home to the bank. They told me it was a victimless crime. They said the drifter had no family and nobody would ever know. I did not want to do it, but they pressured me. I felt a sickening wave of disgust wash over me, but I kept my face entirely impassive. I do not care about your financial excuses, Arthur. I want the original UN-doctored cremation records. I want the real dental files for the John Doe you burned. And I want irrefutable proof that Greg and Brenda paid you to commit this fraud. Higgins looked up, tears streaming down his flushed cheeks. I have it, he whispered desperately. I kept everything. I knew Greg was a ruthless bastard. I knew he might try to pin the whole thing on me if the state fire marshal ever came asking questions. I kept an insurance policy to protect myself. He pushed his heavy chair back and knelt on the floor behind his desk. He pulled back a section of the old stained carpet, revealing a hidden combination floor safe. His hands were shaking so badly it took him 3 attempts to enter the correct numbers. The heavy steel door clicked open. Higgins reached inside and pulled out a thick sealed plastic envelope and a small black digital audio recorder. He stood up and placed them trembling on the desk in front of me. The envelope contains the original coroner report, the actual dental molds of the homeless man, and the real intake logs for that night, Higgins explained, wiping his nose. And the recorder, I wore a wire when Brenda came to my office to finalize the bribe. The audio quality is perfect. You can hear her clearly outlining the entire plan and confirming Greg's new identity in Connecticut. I swear to God this is everything I have. I picked up the plastic envelope, checking the documents inside. The original coroner stamp was clearly visible. I picked up the small digital recorder and pressed the play button. The tiny speaker crackled to life, and the arrogant, undeniable voice of my sister-in-law Brenda filled the quiet room. She was laughing casually, discussing how easy it was to fool a grieving widow and explaining exactly how she would route the $50,000 through her shell company to cover the tracks. It was the ultimate smoking gun. I had everything. I had the indisputable paper trail, the physical records, and a recorded confession proving their massive conspiracy. I slipped the documents and the recorder safely into my tote bag alongside my printed bank statements. I looked down at the pathetic, broken man cowering behind his desk. "You are going to pack a bag, Arthur," I commanded, stepping back toward the locked door. "You are going to leave this town tonight, and you are never coming back. If I ever see your face again, or if you attempt to warn Greg or Brenda that I was here, I will personally mail this entire file to the federal authorities. Do you understand me?" "I understand," he sobbed, nodding frantically. "I am leaving. I promise you will never hear from me again." I unlocked the deadbolt and walked out of the dark, oppressive funeral home, stepping back into the cool evening air. My heart was beating with a steady, rhythmic drum of absolute victory. The terrified, corrupt mortician had given me exactly what I needed. I had successfully isolated the weak link and squeezed until it shattered. I now held the heavy, devastating bullet that would destroy Greg's shiny new billionaire life. I had the legal ammunition. I just needed to set the perfect trap and load the gun. I did not go straight home after leaving Arthur Higgins trembling in his dark and oppressive funeral parlor. The heavy manila envelope sitting on the cracked leather passenger seat of my rusted sedan felt exactly like a loaded weapon. I had the original unedited coroner report. I had the real dental molds proving the burned body belonged to a homeless drifter. I had the small digital audio recorder holding the crystal clear confession of my sister-in-law Brenda as she plotted the entire fake cremation and authorized the $50,000 bribe. I held the absolute total destruction of Gregory Sterling right in the palms of my exhausted hands. But I knew that simply mailing these damning documents to the local police department would trigger a painfully slow bureaucratic process. It would give Greg precious time to hire a team of elite, expensive corporate defense lawyers. He would use his new billionaire family wealth to bury me in endless complex legal motions until I ran out of money and surrendered entirely. I needed to strike a blow so sudden and so completely devastating that his entire fraudulent empire would collapse before he could even pick up a telephone to call an attorney. I needed to look him directly in the eyes when his perfect stolen world ended. I drove my noisy car to a massive 24-hour electronics superstore located out on the commercial highway bypass. The bright artificial fluorescent light stung my tired dry eyes as I walked down the quiet, empty aisles. I paid cash for a cheap prepaid cellular telephone and a standard charger. I also purchased a thick padded shipping envelope and a heavy roll of clear packing tape. I returned to my vehicle and sat in the quiet, empty parking lot, bathed in the dull orange glow of a tall street lamp. I carefully placed the new prepaid phone inside the padded shipping envelope. I took out the high-resolution photographs I had taken of the original cremation records and the fake dental charts. I walked back inside the store to a self-service printing kiosk and printed those crisp, undeniable images onto glossy paper. I slid those heavy pages into the envelope right next to the burner phone. I wrote down the sprawling Connecticut address of his new multi-million-dollar estate, the exact coordinates I had painstakingly copied from Brenda's hidden computer files. I drove to a 24-hour private overnight courier service and paid an exorbitant fee in cash to guarantee secure tracked delivery by the following afternoon. I purposely did not include a return address. I drove back to my small, quiet Ohio house and crawled into my cold bed next to my peacefully sleeping son, Toby. I did not sleep a single wink that night. I just stared at the dark ceiling and waited for the trap to spring. The following afternoon felt like walking through a thick, suffocating swamp of anxiety. I sent Toby to my parents' house again, claiming I desperately needed to work a double overtime shift at the logistics company to cover our rising winter heating bills. Instead, I sat completely alone at my small, scratched kitchen table. I had my personal cell phone sitting exactly in the dead center of the wooden surface. I had programmed the temporary number of the prepaid burner phone into my contacts under a blank name. The silence in the house was heavy and oppressive, ticking away second by agonizing second. At exactly 3:15 in the afternoon, my digital screen suddenly lit up. The caller identification showed an incoming call from a blocked unknown number. My heart slammed against my ribs like a frantic trapped bird, but my hands remained perfectly, incredibly still. I took a deep, long breath, filling my lungs with cold air, and tapped the green accept button. I brought the receiver to my ear and said absolutely nothing. I simply waited for him to speak first. "What is this?" The voice on the other end of the line was a harsh, frantic, and breathless whisper. It was Greg, but the smooth, arrogant confidence he had displayed at the bustling Chicago train station was completely, utterly gone. He sounded terrified, cornered, and wild. "Who is this? What do you want?" "Hello, Greg," I replied, my voice dead calm, completely devoid of the panic or subservience he was expecting to hear. "I sincerely hope you enjoyed the special package I sent to your beautiful new luxury home in Connecticut. Did you manage to intercept and open it before your lovely pregnant heiress wife had a chance to sort through the afternoon mail?" "Abigail." He hissed my name like a venomous curse, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "Are you completely out of your mind? How did you get my private home address? You have absolutely no idea who you are messing with. I told you exactly what would happen if you ever tried to contact me again. I will call the federal authorities right now and tell them you were the active mastermind behind the entire insurance fraud. I will have you arrested and dragged away in handcuffs before the sun goes down today." I let out a slow, dry laugh that echoed sharply in my empty kitchen. I found that laugh from a place deep inside my soul, a place that no longer held a single ounce of fear for this pathetic, manipulative man. "You are not going to call anyone, Greg, because if you dial a single digit, I will personally hand over the original unedited cremation records directly to the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation." I paid a very informative visit to your good friend, Mr. Arthur Higgins, last night. He was incredibly cooperative and eager to talk when faced with the looming threat of a massive federal tax audit. He gave me absolutely everything. I have the real dental molds. I have the coroner report proving you burned a homeless stranger to fake your demise. I even have a crystal clear audio recording of your sister Brenda detailing exactly how much cash you paid to falsify the state death certificates. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute and profound. I could hear his ragged, shallow breathing echoing through the small speaker. The brilliant, impenetrable fortress he had built out of lies, swapped ashes and stolen money had just suffered a catastrophic, fatal breach. I had completely neutralized his blackmail material. He could no longer threaten me with federal prison because I now held the physical, indisputable evidence proving he and Brenda had orchestrated the entire horrific crime entirely without my knowledge. "What do you want, Abby?" He finally asked, his voice trembling with a potent mixture of suppressed rage and sheer paralyzing panic. "You went through all this incredible trouble to track me down across state lines and mail me a burner phone. You obviously want something from me. Just name your price." "I want $500,000 in untraceable cash." I stated my massive financial demand with the cold, precise efficiency of a veteran payroll clerk negotiating a standard corporate contract. "I want $500,000 by this weekend. If I do not have that money physically in my hands by Sunday evening, I am going to pick up this phone and make two very important, devastating calls. The first call will be to your new billionaire father-in-law to politely inform him that his precious daughter is legally married to a bigamist and a wanted federal felon. The second call will be to your sweet, heavily pregnant wife to tell her that her perfect, wealthy husband is currently spending stolen insurance money while his real biological son wears shoes with holes in the soles." "You are insane," Greg shouted, entirely forgetting to whisper to protect his cover. "I cannot simply liquidate $500,000 in raw cash in 3 days. My new wife's family monitors the trust fund accounts very closely. A sudden withdrawal of that massive size would trigger immediate financial red flags across their entire corporate banking network. They would ask relentless, aggressive questions I cannot answer." "That sounds like a terrible personal problem for you to solve, Gregory," I replied, matching his rising panic with absolute chilling indifference. "You managed to fake your own death in a fiery factory explosion and successfully launder $1.5 million through an offshore shell company. I'm entirely confident that a smart, capable, and brilliant businessman like you can figure out how to scrape together $500,000 to save his own skin and protect his shiny new empire. You have until Sunday." I could practically hear the gears grinding violently in his desperate mind. He was a cornered predator, frantically searching for a way out of the legal cage I had just locked tightly around him. He remained completely silent for nearly a full minute, processing the sheer magnitude of the threat and calculating his limited options. When he finally spoke, his tone shifted drastically. The frantic, sweating panic completely vanished. He suddenly sounded dangerously smooth and calm. He had reverted back to the arrogant, calculating monster who always believed he was the smartest person in any room. He mistakenly thought I was just a broke, desperate, and exhausted single mother looking for a quick payout to escape poverty. Fine, he said, his voice dropping to a smooth, lethal baritone. You win, Abby. You want the cash. I will give you the cash. But I'm not wiring it to a traceable bank account, and I am certainly not mailing a duffel bag full of money to a post office box in Ohio. If we are doing this transaction, we are doing it exactly my way. I am listening, I said, maintaining my rigid, emotionless facade. My wife's family is hosting a massive charity gala this Saturday night in New York City. It is a highly exclusive private philanthropic event at a premier luxury hotel ballroom in central Manhattan. There will be hundreds of wealthy guests, powerful investors, and high-profile politicians in attendance. You're going to buy a decent dress, and you are going to walk through the front doors of that hotel. You will meet me in the private, restricted VIP lounge on the second floor at exactly 9 o'clock. I will personally hand you a secure locked briefcase containing $500,000 in small unmarked bills. You will take the money, you will hand over all the original physical evidence you collected from Higgins, and you will walk out of that hotel and disappear from my life forever. Do we have a clear, crystal understanding, Abigail? I knew exactly what he was doing and the psychology behind his demand. He was trying to reassert his dominance by forcing me into his wealthy, intimidating territory. He wanted me surrounded by extreme wealth and corporate power, hoping to paralyze me with his new high society lifestyle. He planned to use the overwhelming, opulent environment of a billionaire charity gala to make me feel small, insignificant, and terrified. He likely had private security guards or hired muscle ready to threaten me in that secluded VIP lounge, ensuring I would quietly take the cash and run back to Ohio like a frightened, beaten dog. He firmly believed that $500,000 would be more than enough to buy my eternal silence and compliance. He thought my entire motivation was rooted in poverty and financial desperation. That arrogant, foolish assumption was going to be his ultimate fatal downfall. I do not have anything appropriate to wear to a billionaire charity gala, Greg, I said, injecting a slight intentional tremor into my voice to make him believe his intimidation tactics were actively working. I am just a payroll clerk from the Midwest. I look poor and exhausted. They will not even let me inside the building, let alone the second floor. Just buy a cheap black dress and act like you belong there for 5 minutes. Greg scoffed, his voice dripping with heavy, insulting condescension. You always were overly dramatic and needy, Abby. Just get on a train to New York. I will leave your name with the private security detail at the front entrance. They will wave you through without asking questions. Just do not make a scene and do not attempt to speak to anyone. Get in, get the cash, and get out. If you try to double-cross me or bring the local police, I swear to you, Abigail, you will not make it out of Manhattan alive. I have money and people who can make a tiny, insignificant problem like you disappear permanently. I understand, Greg, I replied, allowing my voice to sound entirely defeated and submissive. I will be there on Saturday night. Please just have the money ready for me. I just want this terrible nightmare to be completely over so I can feed Toby. Good girl. He sneered, the victory practically radiating through the tiny phone speaker. See you Saturday, Abby. Try to clean yourself up a bit before you arrive so you do not embarrass me. The line went completely dead. I slowly lowered the phone from my ear and set it gently back down on the kitchen table. I sat there in the quiet house listening to the familiar dull hum of the old refrigerator. A slow, dark, and victorious smile spread across my face, reaching all the way to my tired eyes. Greg thought he had successfully managed a major crisis. He thought he had outsmarted a naive, desperate woman by offering her a small fraction of the massive fortune he had stolen from her. He thought the illicit transaction would end quietly in a secluded VIP room hidden away from the prying eyes of his wealthy new family and his billionaire father-in-law. But I did not want his dirty stolen cash. I did not want $500,000 neatly stacked in a briefcase. I wanted absolute, total devastation. I stood up from the kitchen table and walked into my modest bedroom. I pulled out a small, worn cardboard shoebox from the top shelf of my closet. Inside the box were the very last of my active credit cards, the ones I had desperately kept at a zero balance for extreme medical emergencies involving my son. I pulled out a shiny platinum card holding a credit limit just high enough to secure exactly what I needed. I was going to use every single cent of my remaining credit to purchase a direct train ticket to New York and a dress so incredibly stunning it would make the entire charity gala stop and stare. Greg Sterling had officially invited me into the very heart of his stolen empire. He had handed me the exact physical coordinates to his most public and vulnerable moment. He wanted me to meet him in a secret room, but I had a vastly different itinerary planned for our grand dramatic reunion. I was going to take the explosive evidence I had gathered from the terrified mortician and the audio confession from his corrupt sister, and I was going to detonate it directly in the center of that lavish ballroom. I was going to expose his fake death, his illegal bigamy, and his massive insurance fraud in front of every single wealthy investor, politician, and family member he had manipulated. I was going to burn his perfect fake life completely to the ground, and I was going to make absolutely certain he watched me light the match. The trap was officially set, and the monster had walked right through the front door. I stepped off the train at Pennsylvania Station and immediately felt the crushing heavy humidity of a New York City evening pressing against my skin. I did not have a luxurious penthouse suite waiting for me. I did not have a personal chauffeur or a team of professional makeup artists ready to prepare me for the night. All I had was a single piece of luggage and a burning, relentless fire in the center of my chest. Earlier that afternoon, I had walked into a high-end boutique back in Ohio and handed the cashier my emergency platinum credit card. The plastic had been meticulously kept at a zero balance for years, meant only for extreme medical disasters involving Toby. I maxed it out completely in a single transaction without a shred of hesitation. I purchased a stunning, understated midnight blue evening gown made of heavy draped silk. It was not flashy or overly embellished. It was the kind of dress that commanded absolute silent respect. It was the heavy armor of a woman who no longer needed to beg for scraps from anyone. I slipped into the public restroom of a massive midtown department store to change my clothes. I carefully pinned my hair up into a sleek, polished twist, pulling every strand away from my face. I applied a bold, dark crimson lipstick that I had never possessed the sheer courage to wear during my miserable, obedient marriage to Greg. When I finally looked at my reflection in the harsh fluorescent mirror, the exhausted, terrified payroll clerk was entirely gone. The tragic, weeping widow who scrubbed floors to pay off fraudulent debts had been permanently erased from existence. Staring back at me was a cold, calculating architect of absolute ruin. I took a deep breath, smoothed the expensive silk of my gown, and walked out into the chaotic, flashing city streets. The charity gala was being held at a premier 5-star luxury hotel ballroom overlooking the dark expanse of Central Park. As I approached the grand sweeping entrance, I saw a massive fleet of black town cars and imported sports vehicles lined up along the curb. Wealthy, influential guests were stepping out onto a plush red carpet dripping in authentic diamonds and custom-tailored tuxedos. Private security guards with discreet earpieces stood rigidly at the heavy glass doors, strictly checking names against a glowing digital guest list. My heart pounded a frantic, heavy rhythm against my ribs, but my steps remained perfectly measured and slow. I approached the towering security guard and stated my name with absolute authority. For a terrifying, agonizing second, I thought Greg had laid a trap and intended to have me publicly thrown out onto the street to humiliate me. Instead, the guard simply nodded respectfully, tapped his digital tablet, and pulled back the heavy velvet rope. He politely instructed me to proceed to the grand mezzanine on the second floor. Greg had kept his arrogant promise. He had cleared my path because he firmly believed he was about to buy my eternal silence for a mere fraction of his stolen fortune. He truly believed he held absolute ultimate power over my entire existence. I walked up the grand sweeping marble staircase and stepped into the main ballroom. The sheer opulent scale of the event was entirely suffocating to a woman who had spent the last 4 years clipping grocery coupons. Massive crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung from the high vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden light over the glittering crowd. Waiters in pristine white coats moved seamlessly through the room, carrying heavy silver trays loaded with expensive champagne and rare imported caviar. A string quartet played softly in the corner, providing a sophisticated soundtrack to the conversations of the corporate elite. It was a private, exclusive world built on extreme excess and untouchable privilege. I accepted a tall glass of sparkling water from a passing tray and moved silently into the shadows near a massive cascading floral arrangement. I observed the bustling room with the cold, precise efficiency of an apex predator scanning a crowded valley. It did not take me long to find my primary target. Greg was standing near the absolute center of the room, holding court with a group of older, wealthy real estate investors. He was wearing a flawless custom velvet tuxedo that fit his broad shoulders, perfectly highlighting his new wealthy lifestyle. He was laughing that same smooth, charming laugh he used to deploy to win me over when we first met at a cheap diner so many years ago. Standing right beside him, holding his arm with a look of absolute blind adoration, was his beautiful new heiress wife. Her blonde hair fell in perfect soft waves, and her late-stage pregnancy was proudly displayed in a custom maternity gown covered in delicate silver beading. Greg gently placed his large hand on her swollen belly, making a polite, engaging joke that caused the older investors to chuckle warmly. He was playing the demanding role of the devoted, loving family man to absolute flawless perfection. The sight of his effortless deception made a hot, toxic bile rise in the back of my throat. He was eagerly building a brand new golden legacy while my sweet, innocent son wore worn-out shoes with holes in the soles. But the true shock, the sight that made my blood genuinely boil until it felt like liquid fire in my veins, was standing just a few feet away from them. Brenda, my former sister-in-law, the treacherous woman who had cried violently at my husband's fake funeral and stolen my child's entire financial future, was standing right there, sipping expensive vintage champagne. She was wearing a glittering emerald green dress, laughing loudly with a group of wealthy New York socialites. I stepped slightly closer, hiding my face behind a thick marble pillar to listen to their conversation. One of the wealthy older women complimented Brenda's diamond necklace and asked how she knew the billionaire host of the gala. Brenda smiled her signature, fake, sugary smile and smoothly replied that she was Gregory Sterling's distant cousin from out of town, visiting specifically for the charity event. A distant cousin. The sheer towering audacity of their shared lie was almost too massive to comprehend. They were both standing boldly in the bright spotlight, surrounded by billionaires, completely confident that their fraudulent Ohio history was permanently buried forever in fake ash and forged cremation documents. They felt entirely invincible to the laws of consequence. I stood perfectly still, letting the righteous fury wash over every inch of my body until it hardened into a cold, unbreakable focus. I deliberately stepped out from the dark shadows of the pillar and walked slowly toward the outer edge of their wealthy circle. I did not approach them directly or cause a sudden loud scene. I simply positioned myself in Greg's direct line of sight across the room. I waited patiently until he finished his polite conversation about corporate real estate and turned his head to grab another drink from a passing waiter. Our eyes met across the crowded, opulent ballroom. I saw the immediate violent jolt of shock register clearly on his handsome face. The color completely drained from his cheeks. He expected a terrified, ragged single mother in a cheap discount store dress arriving to beg for a handout. He expected a broken, submissive woman who would cower in the dark corners of his wealthy, untouchable world. He absolutely did not expect the polished, commanding woman staring directly back at him in a midnight blue silk gown. His arrogant, confident smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he quickly recovered his deceptive mask. He gave his pregnant wife a gentle excuse, kissed her cheek affectionately, and began walking purposefully toward the grand staircase leading to the private, restricted VIP rooms. He gave me a barely perceptible nod, commanding me to follow his path away from the crowd. I waited exactly 60 agonizing seconds before I placed my glass on a table and followed his exact path through the crowd. The heavy mahogany doors of the VIP lounge were closed tightly, shutting out the loud music and the chatter of the party. I pushed them open and stepped into a dimly lit, secluded room that smelled strongly of expensive leather and polished wood. Greg was standing by a massive oak desk, his broad back turned to me. The heavy doors clicked shut behind me, sealing us inside the quiet space. He spun around, his face completely devoid of the charming warmth he had just displayed to his billionaire investors. His hazel eyes were cold hard and entirely ruthless. He did not offer a polite greeting or a single word of apology for the nightmare he had caused. He simply reached down and picked up a heavy black canvas duffel bag from the floor. He tossed it onto the center of the oak desk with a loud, heavy thud that echoed in the quiet room. $500,000 in used untraceable bills. Greg stated, his voice a low, lethal baritone. Exactly what you demanded, Abigail. You're actually much smarter than I ever gave you credit for. You cleaned up very nicely for tonight too, but let us get one thing absolutely crystal clear right now. This is a one-time final transaction. You take this heavy bag, you walk out the back service elevator of this luxury hotel, and you catch the very next train back to your miserable little life in Ohio. I walked slowly toward the large desk, looking down at the black canvas bag. I did not reach out to touch it. I simply kept my hands relaxed at my sides, refusing to show him a single ounce of fear. And if I refuse your generous offer, Greg, I asked, my voice perfectly steady and calm, what if I decide I like the beautiful scenery here in New York and I want to stay and meet your lovely new family? Greg took a sudden, menacing step forward, invading my personal space to physically intimidate me. Then you die, Abigail, he whispered, his breath hot and angry against my face. You take the money or you disappear for real. Do you honestly think a poor, struggling payroll clerk can extort a man in my current position? I am surrounded by the most powerful, influential people in this entire city. I have the vast financial resources and the dark connections to make sure you simply vanish without a single trace. No one would even bother to look for you. You were a gullible, naive fool who served her temporary purpose when I desperately needed to escape my old gambling debts. Be incredibly grateful I am paying you off tonight instead of putting a permanent bullet in your head. Hand over the physical evidence you stole from Higgins right now and take your cash. I looked deep into his threatening, angry eyes. I searched his dark soul for any lingering trace of humanity, any tiny shred of guilt for completely abandoning his own flesh and blood to poverty. There was absolutely nothing left inside him but pure, unadulterated evil and bottomless, violent greed. He was not a human being anymore. He was a ruthless parasite feeding on the trust of women. I let a slow, dark smile spread across my face. It was a genuine smile that finally made a flicker of true uncertainty appear in his cold, calculating eyes. Keep your dirty money, Gregory, I whispered, leaning in closer so he could hear the absolute lethal certainty vibrating in my voice. I did not come here tonight to become your paid silent accomplice. I do not want a single cent of your stolen fraudulent wealth. I just wanted to look you directly in the eyes one last time before everything you have built shatters into a million unrecognizable pieces. Before he could process my defiant words or attempt to grab my arm, I turned my back on him entirely. I walked confidently toward the heavy mahogany doors, leaving the massive bag of cash sitting completely untouched on the oak desk. He shouted my name, his voice cracking with a sudden violent panic, but I did not stop walking. I pushed the heavy doors open and walked back out into the bright glaring lights of the second-floor balcony. I did not want his money. I wanted his absolute, total, and highly public destruction, and I was going to deliver it right now. The grand ballroom of the New York luxury hotel was an absolute masterclass in extreme wealth and untouchable elite privilege. Massive tiered crystal chandeliers hung heavily from the soaring, intricately painted ceilings, bathing the expansive room in a soft, warm golden glow. The air was incredibly thick, heavy with the rich scent of roasted truffles, expensive vintage champagne, and rare imported perfumes that cost more than my monthly salary. Waiters in immaculate starched white coats glided silently and seamlessly between the linen-draped tables, carrying heavy silver trays loaded with gourmet delicacies. I stood completely still, hidden safely in the deep velvet shadows of the second-floor wrap-around viewing balcony, looking directly down at the glittering sea of high society. The billionaire investors, the powerful local politicians, the elite real estate developers, they were all gathered here completely unaware that a massive, devastating lie was standing right in their very center. The gentle, rhythmic clinking of fine crystal glasses and the low, polite murmur of wealthy conversation slowly faded into a quiet, respectful hush as the billionaire host, a towering silver-haired man named Richard, tapped his silver spoon against his champagne flute. He took the heavy microphone and began speaking with immense, genuine pride about his beloved pregnant daughter and the incredible, trustworthy man she had married. He spoke passionately about trust, about passing the heavy torch of his massive commercial real estate empire to a younger, smarter generation that truly understood the deep value of hard work and unwavering integrity. Every single word of praise he blindly bestowed upon my ex-husband made a hot, toxic bile rise, burning in the back of my throat. I thought about my son Toby wearing his scuffed, hand-me-down sneakers while this room sparkled with diamonds. Then the billionaire gestured broadly to the center VIP table, and Gregory Sterling stood up. The massive room erupted into polite, enthusiastic applause. Greg buttoned his custom-tailored charcoal velvet tuxedo jacket with a practiced, effortless grace. He looked incredibly handsome, incredibly wealthy, and entirely invincible. He strode confidently up the carpeted steps to the grand stage, taking the microphone from his wealthy father-in-law with a warm, humble, carefully practiced smile. He looked out over the massive crowd, his calculating gaze sweeping across the room filled with the very people he was actively deceiving. "Thank you, Richard." He began, his deep, smooth baritone voice echoing perfectly through the state-of-the-art ballroom sound system. He paused, taking a long dramatic moment to look lovingly at his pregnant heiress wife, who was sitting in the very front row, beaming with absolute blind adoration. "When I look around this beautiful room tonight, I do not just see highly successful business partners or wealthy investors. I see family. I see a tight-knit community built on a solid rock foundation of absolute honesty, total transparency, and the sacred, unbreakable trust we place in one another." He placed a large manicured hand over his heart, delivering a sickeningly perfect performance worthy of a seasoned Hollywood actor. Building a lasting legacy is not just about accumulating vast wealth or constructing towering glass buildings. It is about the fundamental truth. It is about knowing that the people standing right beside you in the trenches are exactly who they claim to be. It is about building a life so completely transparent that you never ever have to hide your face in the dark shadows. The sheer suffocating audacity of his hypocritical speech was almost physically painful to endure. He was standing there under the bright spotlights lecturing the most powerful people in New York City about truth and transparency, while the stolen insurance money that rightfully belonged to my young son funded the very tuxedo he was wearing. He was preaching about traditional family values, while the burnt ashes of a nameless, homeless drifter sat permanently in a cheap bronze urn on my living room mantelpiece back in a small town in Ohio. He truly believed he had permanently won the ultimate lottery. He believed his complex web of lies was completely impenetrable. But Greg had made one massive, incredibly fatal miscalculation. He had blindly invited the architect of his total destruction directly into his pristine, secure fortress. While he was busy shaking hands, patting backs, and drinking expensive aged scotch earlier in the evening, I had not been hiding in fear in the private lounge as he had demanded. I had been moving with absolute cold, calculated precision. I had quietly slipped away from the crowded main floor, blending in seamlessly with the rushing catering staff and the busy, panicked event coordinators. I navigated the confusing maze of back hallways and narrow service corridors until I finally found the main audiovisual control room situated high above the main ballroom floor. The room was dark, cool, and filled with rows of glowing digital monitors and complex audio mixing boards. A single young technician wearing oversized headphones was sitting in a rolling leather chair, scrolling lazily through his smartphone, completely bored by the predictable, lengthy charity speeches happening below. I walked in quietly, projecting the confident, hurried, and demanding aura of a professional senior event planner. I pulled a crisp, clean $100 bill from my small evening clutch purse and laid it perfectly flat on the central console right next to his illuminated keyboard. I also placed a small silver USB drive containing my devastating digital arsenal right beside the money. The technician looked up startled and slightly confused by my sudden appearance. I offered him a bright, urgent, conspiratorial smile. "This is a special surprise tribute video from the wife," I told him, my voice light, enthusiastic, and commanding. She wants to play it right in the absolute middle of his keynote speech about building a legacy. It is meant to be a huge, highly emotional surprise for everyone in the room, especially her father. Just plug this drive into the main system, and when he says the exact word foundation, I want you to cut his live microphone feed completely and override all the main projector screens with this specific video file. The young man looked down at the crisp $100 bill, then looked back up at my convincing, friendly smile. He shrugged, casually pocketed the cash without a second thought, and plugged the silver drive directly into his primary broadcast terminal. It is queued up and totally ready to go, he promised, giving me a quick thumbs up. I thanked him politely and slipped back out into the darkened hallway, making my way swiftly up the heavily carpeted stairs to the private viewing balcony. Now standing entirely hidden in the shadows, I watched Greg continue his sickening, hypocritical speech. I clutched the cold, ornate metal railing of the balcony, my heart hammering a frantic, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I had spent 4 agonizing years believing I was a broken, tragic, exhausted widow. I had scrubbed dirty floors, skipped countless meals, and cried until I was completely empty inside. All of that intense pain, all of that profound suffering had crystallized perfectly into this single defining moment in time. I was no longer a helpless victim begging for scraps. I was the executioner preparing to drop the heavy blade. Greg took a slow, deep, dramatic breath, raising his free hand to make his final profound point to the captivated audience. The true ultimate legacy of the Sterling family, he projected confidently to the silent listening crowd, is built on an unshakable foundation. I held my breath tight in my lungs. The trigger word had finally been spoken. In a fraction of a second, the elegant, sophisticated atmosphere in the grand ballroom shifted from opulent high society to absolute technological violence. The young technician up in the control room executed my exact instructions with flawless, immediate precision. Greg's wireless microphone went completely dead, cutting off his smooth, arrogant baritone right in the middle of his next flowing sentence. He tapped the metal mesh of the microphone twice, looking confusedly toward the back of the massive room, assuming it was just a minor, annoying technical glitch. But it was absolutely not a glitch. The 3 massive floor-to-ceiling projector screens mounted directly behind the grand stage suddenly flashed a blinding, harsh, stark white light. The sudden, intense glare made the wealthy guests physically wince, squinting and murmuring in deep confusion. Then the crystal-clear state-of-the-art speakers of the ballroom sound system crackled violently to life. It was not a romantic, sweeping tribute song playing for the newlyweds. It was the frantic, terrified, sweating voice of Arthur Higgins, the sleazy, corrupt Ohio mortician, echoing at maximum deafening volume. The audio recording was crisp, undeniable, and completely legally damning. I had no choice. Higgins' desperate voice blared aggressively, filling the silent, shocked room with his pathetic, whining confession. Greg and his sister Brenda came to my office. They offered me $50,000 in cash. They explicitly told me it was a completely victimless crime. They said the drifter had no family, and nobody in the world would ever know the difference. I took the cash to swap the official dental records and deliberately signed the fake cremation forms so Greg could permanently escape his massive gambling debts and claim the massive insurance money. The entire crowded ballroom froze solid in a state of collective, profound, paralyzing shock. The wealthy guests slowly lowered their expensive champagne flutes, their mouths hanging wide open in utter disbelief. Before anyone could even begin to process the horrific audio confession, the massive bright screens transitioned instantly to the hard visual evidence. High-resolution, vivid photographs of Brenda's offshore corporate wire transfers flashed aggressively across the bright screens, displaying the exact massive dollar amounts, the specific chronological dates, and the fraudulent fake shell companies she used to actively launder the stolen life insurance money. Then the screen shifted again, projecting a massive blown-up, highly detailed image of the original unedited county coroner report, legally proving the burned body found in the factory explosion actually belonged to an unidentified homeless man. Greg turned his entire body around to look at the towering screens looming right behind him. I watched closely from the dark balcony as all the blood completely rapidly drained from his handsome face, leaving him looking like a pale, terrified, lifeless ghost. His perfect, confident, straight posture collapsed instantly inward. He stumbled backward, his feet tangling, almost tripping heavily over his own microphone stand. The giant screens shifted one final devastating time, delivering the ultimate lethal execution blow to his carefully constructed stolen identity. It was a crystal clear, perfectly scanned image of our original Ohio State marriage license. The highly official document clearly displayed the printed name Gregory Miller, legally bound in matrimony to Abigail Miller, dated over 9 years ago, with our original signatures at the bottom. The dates on the document proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that he had never legally divorced me. He had simply faked his fiery, tragic death, completely abandoned his young biological child, and actively committed federal bigamy to marry legally into the powerful billionaire real estate empire. The horrifying truth was entirely naked, completely undeniable, and brutally, aggressively public. The stunned, suffocating silence in the lavish ballroom finally shattered violently, giving way to a scene of absolute, unmitigated, apocalyptic chaos. The beautiful, pregnant heiress, sitting in the front row, let out a piercing, horrifying, guttural shriek that echoed terribly off the hanging crystal chandeliers. She scrambled desperately backward, knocking over her expensive, heavy wooden dining chair, frantically trying to get as far away from the stage and the monstrous stranger she had unknowingly married. Her billionaire father, Richard, the very man who had just publicly praised Greg's flawless integrity, stood up so incredibly fast, he violently knocked over a heavy table full of expensive crystal glassware. His face turned a deep, furious shade of purple, consumed by an apocalyptic corporate rage. He was a ruthless, terrifying titan of industry who had just realized his entire beloved family and massive fortune had been deeply, intimately infiltrated by a common small-town con artist. "Lock the main doors," he roared, his powerful voice booming over the rising, frantic panic of the terrified crowd. "Nobody leaves this building. Call federal security and the police right now." A dozen massive, imposing private security guards wearing dark, tailored suits immediately mobilized with military precision, sprinting toward the main double doors and physically blocking the heavy wooden exits with their broad bodies. The wealthy elite guests began shouting loudly, clamoring over one another in a frantic, desperate panic, grabbing their coats and spouses. It was a spectacular, completely humiliating public collapse of a fake billionaire empire taking place in brutal real time. On the far right side of the massive ballroom, I spotted Brenda, the fake distant cousin who had maliciously helped orchestrate my years of misery, realized the lethal trap had fully sprung perfectly around them. She dropped her half-full expensive champagne glass, watching it shatter into pieces, and made a desperate, pathetic, panicked dash for the side kitchen exit. But in her blind, rushing terror, she completely misjudged the heavy, flowing fabric of her lavish, emerald green evening gown. Her towering, expensive designer heels caught deeply in the thick hem of the dress. She pitched forward rapidly, with a loud, piercing scream, tumbling hard and violently onto the highly polished, slick marble floor, sliding directly into a nearby table of completely shocked foreign investors. She lay there, on the cold ground, sobbing loudly and heavily bruised, her carefully constructed, wealthy, untouchable facade completely, utterly destroyed in front of the entirety of New York high society. Up on the grand illuminated stage, Greg was completely physically paralyzed. The dead silent microphone slipped directly from his trembling, sweaty hands and hit the solid wooden stage floor with a loud, sharp crack, causing a high-pitched, ear-piercing screech of electronic audio feedback to tear through the massive speakers. He fell heavily to his knees, his expensive custom velvet tuxedo pooling messily around him, his chest heaving violently as he gasped for air like a drowning man. He looked frantically, wildly around the chaotic, screaming room, resembling a trapped, desperate rat who finally realized there was absolutely no way out of the raging, burning building he had intentionally created. I stepped fully out from the dark velvet shadows of the second-floor balcony and walked slowly, calmly toward the ornate brass railing. I stood directly under the bright golden downward light of a small crystal wall sconce, making absolutely certain that I was perfectly clearly visible to the broken man kneeling on the stage far below. Greg slowly lifted his heavy head, his terrified, bloodshot, panicked eyes scanning the upper level until they finally locked directly, intimately onto mine. Across the vast, chaotic expanse of the screaming, panicked ballroom, our eyes finally met. He saw the woman he had cruelly called a gullible, naive, insignificant fool. He saw the desperate mother he had callously abandoned to starvation and crushing fraudulent debt. He saw his absolute total legal and social ruin standing tall, immaculate, and fiercely victorious in a midnight blue silk gown. I did not scream a single word. I did not gloat or cheer. I simply looked coldly down at the pathetic, broken monster who had tried to ruin my life, raised my right hand slowly to my temple, and gave him a cold, deliberate, and highly mocking salute. Absolute justice had not just been served. It had been executed with flawless, breathtaking cinematic perfection. The deafening silence that had paralyzed the luxurious New York ballroom shattered into a million jagged pieces of absolute pandemonium. My heart hammered against my ribs with a fierce, triumphant rhythm as I stood on the velvet-draped balcony, watching the complete destruction of Gregory Sterling unfold in real time. The beautiful blonde heiress sitting in the front row let out a horrifying, visceral shriek. She scrambled backward, knocking over her heavy, gilded dining chair, frantically trying to distance herself from the monster she had unknowingly married. Her father, Richard, the billionaire, real estate tycoon who had just publicly praised Greg's flawless integrity, stood up with a speed that defied his age. His face turned a deep, furious shade of purple, consumed by an apocalyptic corporate rage. He was a ruthless titan of industry who had just realized his entire beloved family and massive fortune had been intimately infiltrated by a common small-town con artist. "Lock the main doors!" he roared, his powerful voice booming over the rising frantic panic of the terrified crowd. "Nobody leaves this building. Call federal security and the local police right now." A dozen massive, imposing private security guards wearing dark, tailored suits immediately mobilized with military precision, sprinting toward the main double doors and physically blocking the exits with their broad bodies. Up on the grand illuminated stage, Greg was completely physically paralyzed. He fell heavily to his knees, his expensive custom velvet tuxedo pulling messily around him, his chest heaving violently as he gasped for air like a drowning man. He looked frantically, wildly around the chaotic, screaming room, resembling a trapped, desperate rat who finally realized there was absolutely no way out of the raging, burning building he had intentionally created. The heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom burst open less than 10 minutes later. A swarm of uniformed New York police officers and stern-faced federal agents poured into the room, their bright badges flashing under the sparkling crystal chandeliers. Richard did not just call the local police precinct. He used his immense wealth and powerful connections to bring the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service directly to the charity gala. They marched straight up to the stage. Greg did not even attempt to run or fight. He simply raised his trembling hands as the cold steel handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists with a loud, sharp click. He was loudly read, his Miranda rights in front of the entire glittering assembly of New York high society, arrested on the spot for massive insurance fraud, federal bigamy, identity theft, and grand larceny. As the armed agents dragged him roughly through the center aisle, the arrogant, untouchable billionaire imposter was permanently reduced to a pathetic, weeping criminal. On the far right side of the massive ballroom, I spotted Brenda, the fake distant cousin who had maliciously helped orchestrate my years of absolute misery, realized the lethal trap had fully sprung perfectly around them. She dropped her expensive champagne glass, watching it shatter into sharp pieces, and made a desperate, pathetic, panicked dash for the side kitchen exit. But in her blind, rushing terror, she completely misjudged the heavy, flowing fabric of her lavish, emerald green evening gown. Her towering, expensive designer heels caught deeply in the thick hem of the dress. She pitched forward rapidly, tumbling hard and violently onto the highly polished, slick marble floor. 2 female federal agents were on her in seconds, pulling her arms forcefully behind her back and securing her in tight metal handcuffs. She lay there sobbing loudly, her carefully constructed, wealthy, untouchable facade completely, utterly destroyed. The legal hammer came down on both of them with a swift and brutal severity that only massive federal resources and furious billionaires could properly orchestrate. Over the next several months, the American justice system systematically dismantled every single lie they had ever told. I attended the federal sentencing hearings, sitting quietly in the back row of the grand oak paneled courtroom. Greg stood before the stern federal judge, completely stripped of his expensive velvet suits, wearing a standard-issue orange prison jumpsuit. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow and completely defeated. The judge showed absolutely no mercy to a man who had faked his own fiery demise and abandoned his own young child to steal a massive fortune. Greg was sentenced to 15 grueling years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. He would spend the absolute best remaining years of his precious life locked in a tiny cold concrete cell, surrounded by the very harsh reality he had tried so desperately to escape. Brenda did not fare any better. She was formally charged as a willing accessory to conspiracy, grand larceny, and massive wire fraud. The federal government immediately seized her sprawling, newly renovated suburban mansion back in Ohio. They publicly auctioned off her luxury vehicles, her expensive custom jewelry, and every single piece of imported furniture she had purchased with my son's stolen inheritance. The proceeds were routed directly back to the massive life insurance corporation they had violently defrauded, leaving her absolutely penniless and totally destitute. Standing before the judge, weeping uncontrollably and begging for a leniency she never once showed me, Brenda was sentenced to 5 hard years behind strict iron bars. I watched her being led away by armed bailiffs, feeling a profound, deep sense of ultimate closure wash over my tired, exhausted soul. Because I had proactively blown the whistle on the entire massive operation and meticulously provided the federal agents with an undeniable, flawless financial paper trail, I was completely officially cleared of any and all legal wrongdoing. The thorough Internal Revenue Service auditors reviewed my pristine payroll records and the undeniable audio confession I had secured, confirming without a single shadow of a doubt that I was a completely innocent targeted victim of their elaborate sick scheme. But the absolute greatest reward did not come from the federal government. It came from the very family Greg had tried to completely destroy. The day after the disastrous charity gala, Richard, the billionaire real estate tycoon, invited me to his private corporate office overlooking the towering Manhattan skyline. He was a hard, imposing man, but when he looked at me, his eyes were filled with a deep, genuine, profound gratitude. "You saved my daughter," he said, his deep voice thick with heavy emotion. "You saved her from being completely financially drained and emotionally destroyed by a vicious parasite. I owe you a massive debt that money can never truly fully repay." But Richard was a man who firmly believed in using his vast, immense wealth to permanently correct the cruel injustices of the world. He quietly hired a team of the absolute most elite, expensive corporate lawyers in New York City to represent me entirely free of charge. They went to war on my behalf, fighting the massive life insurance company and the complex legal trust Brenda had deceitfully established. Within a few short, successful months, their brilliant, aggressive litigation yielded a miraculous, beautiful result. The court legally officially dissolved the fraudulent trust and transferred the absolute remainder of the stolen $1.5 million insurance payout directly into a secure, protected educational trust fund for my sweet young son, Toby. My growing boy would never again have to wear scuffed old shoes with holes in their worn soles. His future college tuition, his daily medical care, and his entire financial security were permanently, absolutely, completely guaranteed. The crushing, suffocating, heavy weight of poverty that had chained me to a miserable desk for 4 agonizing, lonely years was finally permanently lifted from my tired, aching shoulders. With the horrifying nightmare finally legally and emotionally concluded, I completely, permanently closed the dark, painful chapter of my long life in that small, struggling Ohio town. I officially resigned from my exhausting, demanding position as a payroll clerk, saying a quiet, polite goodbye to the local logistics company that had unfairly stolen so many long hours of my fleeting youth. Using a small, appropriate portion of the newly secured legal funds, I purchased a beautiful, spacious, sunlit home in a quiet, highly rated suburban neighborhood perfectly nestled near a large green public park. The new house had massive tall windows that let the warm golden morning light completely spill across the pristine polished hardwood floors every single beautiful day. It had a massive wraparound front porch where I could sit peacefully with a hot steaming cup of coffee and simply breathe in the fresh, clean air without a single ounce of lingering fear or heavy, dark anxiety. The wonderful transformation in my precious growing son Toby was the absolute most beautiful, rewarding part of our entire long, difficult journey. He was no longer the quiet, terrified little boy who clutched my thin skirt in a dirty, busy train station, weeping endlessly over a father who had cruelly, maliciously abandoned him. He was absolutely, entirely thriving in his bright, safe, new environment. He quickly made a wonderful, large group of new friends in our quiet, friendly neighborhood. Every beautiful sunny afternoon, I would stand by the large sliding glass doors of our modern spacious kitchen and happily watch him running and laughing freely in our massive, fenced-in green backyard. He played tag on the lush green grass, built towering imaginary forts under the large, shady oak trees, and lived the completely carefree, joyful, innocent childhood he had always deeply, completely deserved. He was entirely safe. He was deeply, unconditionally loved, and he was finally entirely free from the heavy, dark, haunting shadow of Gregory Sterling. As for me, I was no longer the exhausted, weeping, submissive widow who cowered in the dark, lonely shadows of fraudulent credit card debt. I was no longer a helpless, weak victim, waiting helplessly for someone else to dictate the strict, cruel terms of my daily hard existence. I had walked straight bravely through a roaring, blazing, hot inferno of betrayal and emotional manipulation, and I had emerged on the other bright side forged into solid, unbreakable, strong steel. I had proudly become the strong, highly confident architect of my own lasting, beautiful peace and ultimate financial security. On our very first quiet night in the beautiful new house, after I had tucked Toby securely into his warm, soft, comfortable bed, I walked alone out to the edge of our dark, quiet, expansive backyard. In my bare hands, I carried the cheap, heavy bronze urn that had sat mockingly on my lonely mantelpiece for 4 agonizing, miserable, difficult years. The burnt grey ashes inside belonged to a nameless, unfortunate, homeless stranger, an innocent, lost soul who had been maliciously, carelessly used as a simple, disposable prop in a monster's greedy, sick play. I opened the tight, heavy metal lid and gently, deeply, respectfully scattered the fine grey dust into the cool, dark evening breeze, allowing the unknown stranger to finally permanently find a proper, peaceful, quiet resting place in the soft, quiet earth. I tossed the empty, cheap metal urn directly into the deep outdoor trash bin, closing the heavy plastic lid firmly, securely on the miserable past. I walked back inside my warm, brightly lit safe home, locking the strong, heavy front door securely, completely behind me, entirely ready to openly embrace the beautiful, untouched, glorious future waiting patiently ahead. The most important lesson you can possibly take away from my long, harrowing journey is incredibly simple, but absolutely vital. You should never, under any circumstances, underestimate the quiet, relentless determination of a woman who expertly handles the daily company payroll. A fierce mother's unconditional protective love, combined with a sharp, highly trained eye for tracking complex numbers, is an absolutely deadly, unstoppable combination against anyone who attempts to build their wealthy, comfortable life on a rotten foundation of financial lies and cruel emotional manipulation. You must never let a cruel, arrogant partner or a manipulative, toxic family member gaslight you out of your own clear reality. Trust your own sharp instincts, follow the hidden paper trails, and always remember that you possess the incredible inner strength to entirely tear down their fraudulent empires and rebuild a beautiful, peaceful life entirely on your own terms. If you found this incredible story of ultimate justice and fierce maternal protection as deeply satisfying as I did, please hit that like button and absolutely subscribe to the channel so I can continue to bring you more incredible, shocking, true-to-life dramas exactly like this one. And please do not forget to leave a comment down below right now. Tell me what beautiful city you are currently watching this video from and exactly what time it is right there.